Accidentally His, an accidental marriage romance by Piper Sullivan. Copyright 2018. This narration is powered by AI. If you enjoy free audiobooks, consider subscribing for more free stories.
Chapter 1. I had never been fond of the way the grass turned yellow in this town when it got too hot. Nevada was naturally a poor place for maintaining a lawn, but the residents of Good Springs did so anyway, wasting gallons of water standing out on their lawns in the morning with a hose, arching a mist onto their struggling spaghetti grass. I thought about engineering a strand of DNA in the grass seed that would make it more susceptible to extreme heat and low moisture, but I had to shake the thought from my head as I neared the local high school. I was not at the lab anymore, and my job here was going to be much different. As soon as I saw the flagpole out in front of the building, memories built up around my mind like rushing water, and I had to struggle to keep them from flooding in. I wasn't here to reminisce, nor did I want those memories to affect my performance. I parked in the visitors section and stepped out into the dry Nevada air. It was early September and the air smelled of school. I remembered clearly that crisp, scholarly smell that wafted around the week after the first day as I walked into the school, and the nostalgia was so strong my palms began to sweat with the nervousness I had forgotten about after leaving these halls. Before walking inside, I fumbled for my phone and dialed the first number that came up. After a moment, the ringing stopped, and Elizabeth's cool, calm voice rang through the speaker. "Hey, what can I do for you, Macy?" "I'm freaking out," I said, ripping a piece of gum from my bag and stuffing it accordion style into my mouth. "I can't do this." "Sure you can," Elizabeth said without missing a beat. "I know you can, and besides, after the exit you made, you can't come back until those brats are absorbing science and shitting it out." I sighed, already feeling the anxiousness melt away. Elizabeth always knew what to say to me to make me feel better, and I knew she was going to be my crutch while I was away from my company. She was also the capable hands I was leaving my company in while absent. I hung up the phone and walked with a new straightened back. A plaque stood in the yellowing front yard that read, "Welcome to the home of the Good Springs Badgers." It was a new installment, gleaming in the sun, the black marble surely heavy and hot. I wondered how much it had cost, and how many solar panels the school could have installed instead. I tugged on my pencil skirt and gripped the handle to my suitcase tightly. A new intercom system was installed in the front of the school, and I had to press a button to gain access. I eyed the camera curiously, and after a moment, a sharp static beep rang out, and a voice droned through. "Welcome to the home of the Badgers. What's your business at the school today?" "Hi, I'm Macy Johnson. I'm speaking at an assembly today." There was a brief pause, then the voice said, "Macy Johnson?" "Macy. It's been so long." I recognized Linda's voice the moment she said my name, and though I was beginning to sweat in the heat, I smiled at the camera. Though I was trying to stem the rush of memories of my days in the building, I allowed myself to think about Linda. She was the receptionist when I went to school, and I would often work with her, helping her shred papers and do the morning announcements. "Linda, how are you?" "I'm just fine, sweetie. Here, let me open the door for you." A moment later, the door popped and clicked, and I was embraced in the sweet air conditioning. The entrance to the school had been renovated as well, with more modern wall adornments than the last time I had been there. Words like success and pride stretching up the wall in columns. It looked nice, but again, I wondered why the money in the school was going to aesthetic purposes rather than real, substantial educational improvements. "Macy," someone said, and I turned to see Linda rushing toward me, her arms outstretched. She grabbed me into a tight hug, and I hugged her back with the arm that wasn't holding my suitcase. She pulled back, her hands on my shoulders, looking at me as though she was my grandmother and I was visiting for a holiday. "How are you, darling?" "We've heard a few things about your company, obviously. But really, how are you? A husband? Children?" I felt my chest tighten at the mention of children and looked away from her briefly to regain my composure. Children of my own would not be in the cards for me, it seemed, and between starting and maintaining my company, a husband had never been an option. Though I had wanted children when I was younger, I had come to terms with the fact that I would never have any of my own. Not yet. I said, smiling at her, but hopefully soon. I see, Linda said, moving back home to start a family. It's a smart move. Small towns are such good places to raise children, you know? My family has been in this town for generations, and look how well I turned out. I laughed with Linda as she cracked herself up with her own joke. She led me into the office where she scanned my ID and gave me a sticker to identify myself until my badge came in. As I was peeling the sticker and sticking it to my blouse, a man came out of the office adjacent to the main office. Macy Johnson. I looked up to see my old biology teacher standing in front of me. He was a squat old man with a permanent scowl, and it looked as though he hadn't aged a day since I had seen him. But that was probably because he had been ancient when I was in school, too. He looked me up and down once and made a small, gruff noise as though he wasn't impressed. Principal Messer, I said, nodding once in respect. How are you? We'll see, he grumbled, and I wondered how it was that he had gotten to his position with his poor social skills. I had been managing my own company for the past 10 years, and something I had learned is that it's not all about what you're selling. It's about how you sell yourself. And Mr. Messer was like a 10-minute infomercial with poor acting. It had not been his decision to bring me in. I made a proposal to the school board, and they voted unanimously that bringing me to the school was a good idea. To vote for anything else would be foolish. I was offering to come work at the school, improve the science department, and give away a scholarship for scientific excellence at the end of the year. For free. You must be Ms. Johnson. I turned my attention away from the principal and to the young man walking through the door to the office. He smiled brightly at me, and I noticed right away how straight and white his teeth were. He was dressed well, in ironed khakis and a light blue, short-sleeved plaid shirt, with, of all things, a green bow tie. He was wearing heavily rimmed glasses, and his short brown hair was brushed neatly out of his face. He stuck his hand out when he reached me and took it. It is so great to finally meet you, he said. Oh, I'm Matthew Hendrickson. I'm the biology teacher here. I've heard so much about you since moving here, and I'm so fascinated by your work. I'm thrilled to have you aboard. I'm happy to aboard, I said, smiling brightly back at him and switching my suitcase from one hand to the other. Now, do you know who can show me where I should set up for the assembly? Absolutely, he said. I can show you right now if you're done speaking with Mr. Messer. I turned and looked at the grumpy principal, who was still standing with his arms crossed, glaring at the two of us. He waved one hand at us impatiently, as though he was just waiting for us to get out of his office. Always a pleasure, Mr. Messer, I said, smiling at him as Mr. Hendrickson led me from the office. I followed him through the halls, noticing many aesthetically oriented changes. The hallways were lined with all new lockers, fresh tile, and murals. The school really was beautiful, much more modern and pleasing to the eye than the last time I had been in the building. How long have you been working here, Mr. Hendrickson? I asked, trying to break the silence building between us. He looked back at me excitedly as we went through the doors to the auditorium. Please call me Matt. This is my second year teaching here. And how long have you been teaching? I asked, looking around at the huge, newly installed auditorium as we walked. The room was like a large movie theater, with a cool atmosphere. I looked up to the stage and saw a huge backdrop for displaying media, and wondered where the school had gotten the money for all the improvements. This is my second year teaching, Matt said, his cheeks flushing a dark red, as though he was embarrassed to be so new. The first year was a challenge, the science program here. It doesn't have much support. I am so excited to have you here. I really think the kids will appreciate a role model like you, and the restructuring will be so nice. I would really like to get the kids more involved in the science, you know? Let them touch and feel. Experience it rather than reading it out of a textbook. That's exactly the kind of input I'm looking for, I said as we climbed the steps to the stage. I set my suitcase down next to the podium and looked out at the room, running through my mind what I was going to say to all the young people in the crowd. Matt pointed out the features of the stage, showing me how to connect my devices and giving me the clicker for the slides. He explained that when the assembly started, the theater kids would control the lighting for the stage. Well, he said, glancing down at his watch, I got someone to cover my study hall for me when I heard you had arrived, so I had better get back and relieve them. I laughed and waved to him as he hurried back down the steps. I pulled my tablet out and plugged it into the HDMI cable labeled Display and took another look through the presentation. I had my notes attached to each slide and had gone through the speech several times with Elizabeth, so I knew I was prepared. A flutter of nervousness ran through my stomach when the intercom came on and announced that when the bell rang, the students were to report to the auditorium for an assembly. I brushed my hair back from my face and walked back behind the stage. I took a sip of the green tea I had brought and wiggled my fingers, which was my go-to outlet when I was nervous. The other go-to outlet would have been to give Elizabeth another call, but it was too late for that, because the assembly was starting, and it was going to be my turn soon. I tried to channel some of the energy that Elizabeth had. I shook out my fingers and thought about the motivational calendar Elizabeth kept above her desk. Mr. Messer climbed the steps with some difficulty and approached the podium when the auditorium was nearly full. He may have been old and stubborn, but he commanded the students' respect. And as soon as he put his hands on the top of the podium, the auditorium hushed. I peeked out behind the curtain, and although not all of the students were paying attention, they were all silent as Mr. Messer began to speak. We have a very special guest speaking for us today, he began, his voice low and monotone, as though he didn't believe a word he was saying. I ask that you give Ms. Macy Johnson your full attention. She has been brought on board as the new Science Department Supervisor. Ms. Macy Johnson is the founder of X-Cell Corporations, a biochemical engineering company that works toward advancing the technology of tomorrow. Here, Mr. Messer paused and shook his head, as though he didn't approve of the mission statement. He cleared his throat and continued. Ms. Johnson has prepared a presentation for you to explain her new position and the effect it will have on your education and your futures. Thank you, and please welcome her warmly to the stage and to our school. A quiet applause followed as Mr. Messer walked off the stage and gave me a look as though he hoped I knew what I was doing. I didn't really, but I never had, so I just walked out onto the stage and smiled as brightly as I could. When I reached the podium, I immediately found Matt in the crowd and made eye contact with him. He waved and gave a thumbs up as I leaned toward the microphone. Wow, I drawled, in a voice I hoped mimicked Mr. Messer's. What an exciting introduction. The kids collectively laughed, and some put their hands to their mouths, as though they could not believe I would have the guts to do it. I straightened my back. I needed to get them to like me if my program was going to be a success, so I didn't feel bad at all for using Mr. Messer to get there. I'm sure you are all itching to get out of this room, I said, clicking on my first slide. A microscopic moving image of a cell splitting apart appeared on the screen behind me, and I continued. So I'll make this as simple and brief as possible. I went to this school. I walked through these same halls, sat in the same classrooms, and though I was sporting high waters and permed hair, we were the same. As a kid, none of us ever thought we were going to be much. We were born here in Good Springs, raised here, and most us assumed we would work here and eventually be buried in the Good Springs Cemetery. I took a sip of my water and looked out into the crowd, realizing most of the kids were actually looking at me and appeared as though they were listening to what I had to say. I had a dream, I continued, and that dream was to not do that. I loved science, and I loved learning, and I loved it so much I started this company. I changed the slide to one with my company logo, and some of the kids whispered to each other as though they recognized it. I changed DNA. I mess with how organisms work, on a molecular level. I make plants grow taller. I make people grow smarter. I make science that works harder. My labs conduct research that contributes to health, social change, and scientific discovery. At each point, I change the slide to another eye-catching image. And I want to make my dream possible for each and every one of you. And that's why I am going to be restructuring the science department here at Good Springs High. Over the next couple of weeks, you are going to see new equipment, and you are going to experience some alteration in lesson plans. Many of you will begin going on field trips at least once a month, perhaps once a week. You will learn more, you will experience more, and if you work hard at science, it will give back to you. Any student who earns an A in their science class this year will automatically receive a $5,000 scholarship from me, as well as a $500 gift card for your own personal spending. The auditorium erupted in talking, and I waited until it had quieted down to click to my next slide, which was a picture of me, standing next to my first win at the science fair. And if you think that's exciting, at the end of the year I will be holding my Excellence in Science Fair. Every person is encouraged to enter because, among other prizes, the winner will be receiving a $100,000 scholarship from me to use at the college of their choice. Again, the auditorium erupted, and I could not contain my smile. I put my hand over the microphone and looked away from the kids as they squirmed around and grinned, many of them looking like they could not believe it. "Those are the important things," I said when they had quieted down again. "If you have any questions for me, or if any of you would like to sit down and talk about science with me, I'm always available. I will be moving into my office soon, and my door will always be open. I look forward to working with each and every one of you." I nodded and walked away from the podium, and the kids erupted in cheers and applause. Mr. Messer was still glaring at me as I walked off the stage, but I could not keep the smile from my face as I walked down the steps. Mr. Messer went back to the stage where the picture of me was still displayed and told the kids to all report to their 6th period classes and to walk the halls quietly as they did. "That was spectacular," Matt said, catching me off guard, coming around the corner as I got to the bottom of the steps. I nodded and pushed my hair out of my face as I met his bright green eyes. "Really, the kids have never looked that excited about science before," he said, shaking his head incredulously. "I don't have a 6th period class, so if you would like, I can show you to where your office will be located." "That would be great," I said. I retrieved my tablet from the stage and stored it back inside my suitcase, then followed Matt out of the auditorium into the science wing of the school. As we walked, it was like the school transformed, taking me back in time. The modern changes fell away, and the science portion of the building was the same black and white tile and peeling paint that had been there when I attended. "Wow," I said, peeking into a few of the classrooms as we went by. The long counters with sinks were rusty and the tiles were cracked, and the windows were propped open with books and rulers. In one classroom, a teacher was sitting at her desk, reading as a video played on an old projector. "It's the only program in the building that hasn't received a bump in funding," Matt said. "We have Bunsen burners from the 80s. This part of the building doesn't have AC yet. It's frustrating to teach a room of kids who are all sweaty and itching to get outside." "I can imagine," I said. Matt stopped outside of a door and opened it to reveal a small, cramped office. The windows weren't open, so the room was hot and dank, smelling exactly like an old high school might smell. "Enjoy," Matt said sarcastically. "I should get back to my classroom and prep for the 7th period. I'll see you around, Ms. Johnson." "Please," I said. "Call me Macy." He smiled and nodded, turning and heading down the aging hallway. I shook my head and went into my office, wrenching open the window. I rolled my sleeves up and pushed the old desk to the other side of the room. In a janitor's closet, I found cleaning supplies and cleaned the surfaces in the room. By the time I was finished, I was sweating and gasping, with my face pressed up to the screen in the window, trying to get a breath of fresh air. The final bell rang, and I examined the area outside the building. My office had a good view of the courtyard and drive, and I watched parents pull up to get their kids. My eyes were drawn to one man in particular, who climbed out of a Kia and headed for the main office. Though I was a good distance from him, I caught a glimpse of his face and recognized him. It was Brad Walker.
Chapter 2. I hated coming back. Every time I had to come to pick Stella up from school or bring her something she forgot, I had to see the flagpole and the football field behind the high school, which only brought back unpleasant memories. And I had been picking her up a lot more than normal. Every other day she did something wrong, and one of her teachers would call me, saying they were keeping her for detention, and she wouldn't be able to take the bus. The people in the building, even the teachers, were nice enough. They knew me, or at least they knew my history. I ran a hand over my head and felt a shiver crawl up my back. I had the feeling that someone was watching me. But when I glanced around the parking lot, there was nobody. As I was walking past the new black marble sign, I had the feeling again. I looked over to the side of the building and saw a flash of strawberry blonde hair disappear from the window. It was decidedly a woman. It caught me off guard and I stopped in my tracks, staring at the window to see if she would come back. After a minute had passed, I shook my head and continued on my way. I hadn't seen hair like that in 20 years, since graduation day. After being beeped into the building, I chewed on my thumb and thought about strawberry blonde hair and late nights working on English papers. I could still smell the rosewater perfume she used, and I could still see her chewing on the tip of her pen as she stared down at the textbook, her strawberry blonde curls tumbling loose around her shoulders. "Mr. Walker," the principal said, meeting me outside the office, as soon as I felt the air conditioning on my face. "Thank you for coming." I nodded and continued chewing on my thumb, looking around for my daughter, who was the reason I had left the mechanic shop early. She was the reason I was going to have to deal with the bag of bones principal. I could not remember his name, but I knew it started with an M. He led me to his office, where Stella was sitting with her arms crossed and her head bowed. When we walked in, she met my eyes and shrugged with a "what can you do" look on her face. "Stella, would you care to tell your father why he's here today?" Stella raised a single eyebrow while looking at the principal. He stared down at her, and I watched as the two of them had some sort of competition with their gazes. Stella reminded me so much of her mother when she was staring at the principal that I had to take a breath to keep a wave of sadness from rushing into my throat. Stella tipped her chin up the same way her mother had, and met the principal's glare with her own unwavering stare. "I'm assuming you called him," Stella said, a lilt to her voice, as though she had won the game. "Otherwise, I am not quite sure why he would leave work to come and see you." The principal glared at her vehemently for a moment, and I had to stifle a chuckle. I straightened up my face right away when he turned to me. "Mr. Walker, Stella's in this office because, for the 4th time this quarter, she has shown extreme disrespect toward her teachers. Behavior like this is simply not allowed at Good Springs High School. Not only will she be serving an in-school suspension, but I would like her to write a letter of apology to her teacher as well." After I had promised to him that I would be punishing Stella severely for her poor behavior, he released us, and we walked through the front doors, like convicts released. When we passed the trophy case, I saw the plaque with my name on it. Brad Walker. Most rushing yards in a season. Current record holder. Stella must have seen me looking because she put a hand on my arm. I felt a twinge of pain in my knee, and for a moment, relived the last game of my high school career, in which my leg twisted violently in a way it wasn't supposed to, and my ACL was done for, just like my plans to play college ball. "It's okay, Dad," Stella said, unwrapping one of the strawberry suckers she was obsessed with and popping it in her mouth. "Nobody looks at those dusty old things anyway." A moment passed and we kept walking, and I kept thinking about the dusty old thing, except it wasn't the plaque. It was me. Stella was squinting into the sun and moved her sucker from one side of her mouth to the other. "You know I'm not writing a letter of apology, right?" I chuckled. "I figured. What happened this time? Mrs. Remington thinks she knows everything, and it gets tiresome. In English today." Though I was listening to Stella tell her story, I scanned the windows again as we neared my car, hoping to see that familiar head of strawberry blonde hair. It had been so long, and I knew it was completely possible that I was only imagining it. I remembered the way she carried her books in the hall, pressed up against her chest as though she thought someone was going to rip them away from her. I remembered walking over to her house after football practice, but not telling any of my friends where I was going. She always kept the window in her room open, so when I stretched out on her floor so she could help me study, I was swathed in the rich, crisp fall air. Anyway, how was work? Did Georgie cut you some slack about coming to get me, or do I need to come in and show her my cute little face? I thought of Georgie, my boss at the mechanic's shop. She was nearing 60 years old, with graying hair that she always tied back in a bandana, and worn jeans that were always covered in oil. She was a good boss, and she was usually pretty lenient when it came to kids. "Yeah, it's fine, kid," I said, opening the door and sliding inside the car. It wasn't my ideal model, but it was fuel efficient. You know Georgie loves me anyway. Stella scoffed and pulled her seatbelt on, and we started pulling out of the parking lot. She mumbled something under her breath, and I glanced over at her. "What did you say?" "Dad, stop!" I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a shuddering stop. Stella had her hand on the dash and was breathing heavily. Adrenaline coursed through my body as I looked her over, making sure she was okay. When I was sure she hadn't hurt herself, I looked to the front of the car, trying to figure out what Stella had been so concerned about me hitting. Crouched in front of the car was a woman cupping something in her hand. I followed her long legs all the way from her black flats to where her thighs disappeared under her skirt as it rode dangerously high. She was wearing a loose pink blouse, and my eyes grazed over the ruffles and up to the freckled cheeks and strawberry blonde hair. "Miss Johnson?" Stella said just as I said, "Macy?" Macy looked up at us and her eyes widened. I was sure she recognized me. I felt a sudden rush of nervousness. I hadn't seen her in years, and I wondered how my current appearance compared to my teenage appearance. She didn't seem that concerned with my appearance, however, and stood up, still holding the bird in her hand. She didn't even seem concerned about her skirt, which was still bunched around her hips from crouching. "Are you okay?" I asked, as she walked over and laid the bird out on my hood without asking permission. I was so shocked to see her. My mind classified that as a very Macy-like action, without really thinking about it. She had always taken what she wanted and done whatever she thought was right without thinking to ask if it was okay. "I am perfectly fine," Macy said, glancing at me quickly, then looking back at the bird. Her eyes were a dark green. "Thank you for not hitting me. This bird isn't okay, however. Would you happen to have a pen cap?" "What?" I asked, looking at her incredulously, as Stella ran back to the car door. I saw her dive inside, then return seconds later with a cap from a pen. She handed it to Macy, her face serious and set. I didn't know how to react, so I just stood back and watched as Macy, with one finger, gave the bird chest compressions. A moment later, she took the pen cap and placed it in the bird's beak, using it to give it breaths. I watched Stella as she watched the display, and I realized this was something Macy would have done in high school as well. And of course, she would have known bird CPR. A moment later, the bird fluttered back to life, and Stella put her hand to her mouth, watching with wide eyes as the bird moved away from Macy and stood up on the hood of the car. "Go on," Macy said softly, and a moment later, the bird flew away. We all stood silently around the car for a moment, watching it as it lifted up over the tree line and disappeared. "What happened?" Stella asked, breaking the silence. Macy looked over at her as though she had just realized for the first time that she was there. Macy pushed her hair back away from her face and pointed toward one of the windows on the part of the building that I remembered being the science wing. "The bird flew into my window. It hit pretty hard. I came out here to find it, and that's when I ran in front of your car." She trailed off, turning to me and taking me in as if for the first time. I wondered suddenly if I smelled like motor oil and sweat. I could smell her, and she smelled like lavender. "That's amazing," Stella said, her eyes dreamy as she looked over the tree line in the direction the bird had gone. Macy didn't take her eyes off me, however, and my brain was still catching up and putting all the information from the event together. "Wait," I said, glancing back toward the building. "You work here?" "As of today," Macy said, blushing. "Wait," Stella said, and I could hear myself in her voice. "You guys know each other?" "Yeah," I said, still looking at Macy. "We went to high school together." Stella crossed her arms and leaned against the car, which was still running. In the middle of the parking lot, I cleared my throat and tore my gaze away from Macy, whose blush had intensified. I wanted to wrap her up in a hug, and I wanted to see how much of her had changed since the last time I had seen her. I felt my own face start to redden, and Macy cleared her throat, taking an awkward step backward and tucking her hair behind her ear. "I should probably get back inside," she said. "I need to finish setting up my office, and there's so much to be done." She glanced from me and then to Stella. "Brad, it was nice seeing you again. And it was nice to meet you, Stella Walker," Stella said, sticking out her hand. Macy looked surprised, but she took it and they shook. I watched in awe, not really sure what was going on. "Stella, right," Macy said. She released Stella's hand and nodded at me once more, before twisting around and hurrying back to the building. When we got back in the car, it was silent for a moment. After the car bumped out of the parking lot and onto the road, Stella reached for the volume knob and turned it once sharply to turn it all the way down. "What was that?" she asked, her voice an octave higher than normal. "You're asking me?" I said, laughing and mimicking her high voice. "You shook her hand." "What was that?" Stella huffed and crossed her arms, looking away from me and out the window. Fine, redirect to me, but you were totally giving Ms. Johnson googly eyes. I scoffed, but even as I did, I felt my cheeks redden. As we got onto the highway, I reached over and turned the radio up, trying to keep from thinking about strawberry blonde braids.
Chapter 3. Ms. Johnson? I jolted and smacked my head on the desk I was crawling underneath. Though my office was mostly organized and ready, I was still putting the finishing touches on the room, and that involved me being on my hands and knees under the desk. After stifling a curse and plugging my laptop in, I crawled out from under the desk in a very undignified fashion. When I was out and standing, I turned to the student, straightening my hair, and attempted to compensate by appearing professional. Stella was at the door, leaning confidently on the door jamb. She was wearing red Converse high tops and jean shorts with an old varsity football jacket I realized was her father's. I was reminded of him so strongly, I could almost smell the cologne he used to wear, the cologne that stuck to everything in my room after he left. The cologne that I would hold my pillows to my face for, hoping to catch a whiff. I thought of the time he had let me wear his varsity jacket when the heater in my room went out, even though he was just as cold as I was. That night, when the varsity jacket hadn't been much help, we had scooted closer and closer together until I could feel his side and his thigh pressed against mine. And then I thought about how we had been the same height until the summer of 7th grade, and I thought about how that was the summer that Brad had gotten taller and stronger, and when he had his first girlfriend. I broke myself of my reverie and refocused on Stella. She looked concerned, a single eyebrow raised as she watched me struggle to communicate like a normal human being. I was not used to being flustered in front of people, especially not after I left high school and successfully started my own business. Though I was at least a decade older, I was right back to feeling like I was the nerd, and I had to gather myself. "Yes?" I asked, clearing my throat immediately afterward when I found it to be gravelly and hoarse. I brushed my hair back from my face and stood up straighter, tugging on my skirt to make sure it was in place after my under-the-desk excavation. "I have some ideas for an entry for the science fair," Stella said, snapping her gum and pulling a piece of folded notebook paper from her pocket. She walked over to my desk as I sat down, taking my glasses out of their case and putting them on. She slid the paper over to me and I held it up, looking closely at some schematics she had drawn by hand. On the paper, there were more than 4 or 5 versions of the same idea, with different parts and mechanisms to make it work. My brain got to work immediately, focusing on weak parts of each design and trying to figure out how to make it work better. I started to think about putting several different designs together, combining some of the features to make the ultimate functional prototype. "This is really something," I said, lowering my glasses and looking at her. "For something like this to work, you'd have to really integrate moving parts and coding. The technology alone would be difficult to perfect, and then testing it out would be difficult." "I know it's far-fetched," Stella said, "but I really think it could be a helpful thing. I can get some parts from my dad, and he might be able to help with some of the mechanics." "Your dad's a mechanic?" I looked up at her, and with my glasses on, I could see freckles spattered over her nose and cheeks. I had never imagined Brad being a mechanic, but now I could not get the image of him slinging a greased-up rag over his shoulder and walking toward me out of my mind. I thought of his arms wrapping around me, strong from working on the cars. I had never imagined him being a mechanic, but then again, I had never imagined him being anything other than a football player and the high school sweetheart. "Yeah," Stella laughed. "Not a very good one from what I've heard, but he could at least help, you know?" "Do you guys have the space to work on something like this?" I asked, trying to get a feel for where Brad was living. Though the device that she wanted to build wasn't that big, it would be important to be able to spread out the parts and really see how the device would fit together. "Yeah," Stella said, rolling her eyes. "Dad would have a cow if we tried to do it in the living room, but I can just work on it in my room and he won't bother me. We have an agreement about my room. No dead animals and no rotting food, and it's mine for whatever I want to do." Stella trailed off as though she was redirecting herself. "Well, except for black walls. Apparently those are too hard to paint over, and he's not planning on living there forever. Whatever. Anyway, I'm willing to put the work in. I can learn to code or find someone to help me or..." I'm here because I wanted to ask you to help me. I don't know if that's against the rules or whatever, but you said your door was always open, so I cleared my throat and looked up at her, feeling a swell of pride and happiness. Though looking at her, I wouldn't have thought about it. I realized she was a lot like I was when I was in school. She wanted to do something amazing, and nothing was going to stop her. Of course I'll help you, I said, folding the paper up neatly for her. I make the rules, and so far I haven't added any rules about my involvement with the projects, so I think we should do it. Did you have any ideas for application of this device? I think it's a cool idea, but I also think you need to really think about its impact on the real world. That's an important part of innovation. Well, she said, veterinary clinics, classrooms, pretty much anywhere, you know? If we could make them cheap enough, they might be useful for pet owners, too. I nodded, still thinking, and handed her paper back to her. She took a pen from her back pocket and brought it up to her lips, yanking the cap off with her teeth. She scribbled something on the clean part of the folded paper. She slid it back across my desk to me, and I realized her nails were painted black. I picked up the paper, confused, and turned it over to see what she had written. An address was scrawled in messy black ink. 201 West Front Street, Good Springs, Nevada. You can bring that with you when you come tonight? Stella said, emphatically capping her pen. You can eat with us, too. My dad's a pretty good cook. Be there around 5 and we can work before supper. I was baffled at this proposal, and at the fact that she was telling me and not asking, but she was already walking out of my office, grinning at me as she went. Although she appeared to be pretty normal, I was quickly realizing how astute she was. As she reached the doorway, I was still searching for words, and she just waved before slipping back out into the hall. I pulled out my phone and called Elizabeth, who answered on the first ring. Macy, she said. How can I be of service? Sell the whole company, I said. A girl at this school, Brad Walker's daughter, just asked me to help her with her project, and she expects me to come to her house. Wow, Elizabeth said. Well, at least you will be getting some. I scoffed into the phone. But really, I said, do you think it's okay for me to do something like that? I'm not technically an employee of the school. You're right, Elizabeth said, because you don't need to be. You are your own boss. Do whatever you want. You're right, I said. I'll think about it. Part of me still wants to back out, but I might go. I don't know. We talked a little while longer about what was going on with the company, and when I was certain everything was going okay without my presence, I wished her a good evening and hung up the phone. In the silence that followed, I opened her schematics back up and looked at them again. It was interesting to see what she had come up with. I was deep in thought examining the page when a knock came from the open door and made me jump in my seat. Sorry, Matt said, holding his hands up as he walked into my office. Didn't mean to scare you. He looked around the room and back to me. I really like what you've done with the place, he said jokingly, sitting down in the chair in front of my desk. Yeah, I replied, not looking up from the schematics. My favorite part is the air conditioner. Yes, Matt laughed. You caught me. That is the only reason I came in here. After a beat, he said, What are you looking at there? I cleared my throat and slid the schematics over to him so he could take a look. I explained the premise of the device briefly, and he raised his eyebrows as he looked over them. It was obviously going to be a difficult project, especially for a high school student. She says her dad's a mechanic and should be able to help with the machine portion of the device, but as far as the interface, data, and interpretation, she's going to have to learn it herself. Matt looked up at me, then back down at the schematic. He worried his bottom lip and furrowed his brow, and for a moment I thought that perhaps, when he was thinking particularly hard, he might have been kind of cute. I double majored, he said. Did you know that? In biology and computer science. I blinked as he slid the schematics over to me. He ran his hands over his khakis and fixed me with a curious gaze. Again, I was struck with the bright green color of his eyes, excited and ready where mine wasn't. I thought of the statistical probability that two people might be working at the same school and have green eyes, an occurrence that was already rare. I would be happy to help her with the coding aspect of the assembly, he said, tilting his head the slightest bit. But I don't know if you can count on her following through with this idea. I would just hate to see you dedicate time and energy to it, only to have it fall through. What? Why not? I felt something heavy in my stomach and was reminded of my time in high school when people would gossip about other students. I had never really been interested in it, and I was getting the familiar feeling now that Matt was about to tell me something I would wish I didn't know. Matt cleared his throat and brought his fist to his lips, looking away from me as he spoke. Suddenly, he looked paler than when he had first come into my room, as though something was weighing on him. Stella is bright, but she's not driven. She hardly comes to class, and when she does, she's sent out half the time for disrespect or disruption. It's not that she isn't a good kid. It's just that anyone would react this way if... Matt stopped talking as though I was supposed to know what he was referencing. If what? I asked, leaning forward slightly. It seemed to me that there was a lot I didn't know about Brad and his daughter, and if I could get answers from Matt, then so be it. Even if it felt like I was prying to do it. Stella's mother passed away a few years ago, he said softly, not meeting my eyes. I didn't work here then, obviously, but it's in her file as a red flag, especially because the teachers around here know her as a troubled student. The file isn't too specific, but... Matt took a deep breath again. Her mother, well, she ended her own life. I took a deep breath and looked out the window, wondering for the first time who Stella's mother was. I wondered not only what the toll was that it had on Brad, but also the toll on Stella. It had to be painful to lose your mother, and to watch your father lose her as well. There was also something especially disheartening about learning how her mother had died. Would Stella be able to go through her life without wondering if it was something she did or something she didn't do? I'm sorry, Matt said. Is there a polite way of saying that? I feel like that sounded so accusatory. I didn't mean to upset you. I focused back on Matt, as for a moment I had forgotten he was in the room with me. He looked upset, and I was glad he wasn't gleefully giving me this information. It seemed to me that he really was just trying to respect my best interests. No, I said, waving my hand as though it was nothing. Don't worry about it, I'm glad I know. It seems like something important to keep in mind if I am going to be working with her on this project, you know? Yeah, Matt said. Then, well, I think my AC time is up, so I had better get back to my classroom. He stood up from the chair smoothly and smiled at me before heading back down the hallway. As soon as he was gone, I let my head fall to my arms and tried to figure out how to get out of my newly acquired study date with Brad Walker's daughter.
Chapter 4. Dad! Stella called, her voice echoing through the house moments before the thud of her backpack hitting the floor in the kitchen. I'm in the study, I answered. The study was the room where we dumped all our unfinished hobbies around the old computer desk. I was paying the bills online and was using our ancient PC to slowly click through each of the links. Stella appeared at the doorway to the study and examined her nails. What do you have planned for supper tonight? I glanced over at her. I don't know. Why? Are you having friends over? We both knew that was a joke because even if she did have friends, she certainly wouldn't bring them around me. Stella scoffed and turned her hand over in a gesture that reminded me strikingly of her mother. No, but you are. I just thought you might want to make something good. I balled an envelope up and tossed it across the room like it was a basketball. It hit the rim of the trash can and bounced out onto the floor. I answered as Stella was leaning down to pick it up. What do you mean? I said, shaking my head and looking back at the stack of bills I had to pay. Well, Stella said, you know those schematics I showed you last night? I talked to Ms. Johnson about it, and she said she's interested. She's coming over tonight to help me with it. A jolting shiver ran up my back, and I suddenly could not concentrate on the screen in front of me at all. All I could think about was the potential mess that was scattered around the house. When Macy would be arriving, what she would see, what she would think, what I would possibly make for her that would impress her. Whoa, Stella said, uncrossing her arms and snapping once in front of me as though she needed to break me from a trance. One thing at a time, Tiger. Why don't you run to the store and get what you need to make a delicious supper, and I'll clean up the house a bit." I nodded and then quickly hit the power button on the computer. Stella was shaking her head as she walked out of the room, muttering to herself. I jumped up and grabbed my wallet, eager to get to the store and make something Macy would like. I knew that she was a vegetarian in high school, but I didn't know if that was something that had persisted through college. As I was driving to the store, a cold shiver ran down my back. What if she was vegan? When I got into the store, I looked through some recipes on my phone and found a vegan supper that looked fairly palatable. I picked up all the ingredients and raced home, realizing I hadn't even asked Stella when Macy would be arriving. Stella was vacuuming when I stepped back inside, and to my surprise, she had actually done a pretty good job of cleaning the house, despite the fact that not once in her entire life had she managed to complete a chore without me dogging her to get it done. I wondered if she was just as excited as I was for Macy to come over. "Who taught you to use the vacuum cleaner?" I asked jokingly. "I've never seen you operate it before." "Mom," Stella said as she hit the red power button and stuck the vacuum in its upright position. She didn't look at me as she gathered the cord up and wound it tightly around the vacuum. For a moment, the house was silent. Then Stella looked up, ran a hand over her hair, and spoke. "Miss Johnson should be here soon," she said, wheeling the vacuum cleaner back over to the closet where we kept it. "I'm going to finish cleaning the bathroom, then everything should be taken care of." I nodded and looked away, not sure why a knot had gathered in my throat. I moved to the kitchen and set out my ingredients, painting a mental picture in my mind of what the final product would look like. As I chopped vegetables, I thought about high school again, and how Macy had very few friends. We had lived on the same street growing up, and somehow, though our friend groups changed dramatically, we managed to stay friends. Even at the beginning of our senior year, we would hang out and study together. Walking to her house after school or work or practice was just as natural for me as walking to my own house. I was thinking about the way her room used to look, the pink walls, the thousands of pillows, when the doorbell rang, nearly making me swipe an entire pile of sliced carrots from the counter. Stella raced through the house to open it, and when she did, I recognized Macy's voice right away. Stella was talking at a million words a minute, clearly leading Macy from the door and further into the house. I thought for sure she would stop in the kitchen so I could say hi, but she pulled Macy directly down the hall into her bedroom. A moment later, I heard the door close and Stella's excited voice coming through the door as she talked about versatility and range of motion. I continued on making supper, and when it was nearly ready, I walked to Stella's room, knocking on the door. When nobody answered, I opened it slowly to see Macy and Stella bent over some papers, talking animatedly about whatever it was that they were working on. "Supper will be done soon," I said, hoping to draw the attention of at least one of the girls. Macy did glance up at me, but quickly looked back down at what she was writing as though I wasn't as interesting. "Excellent, Dad," Stella said, shuffling some of the papers around and clicking on something on her laptop. "We'll be right out." I stood there for a moment more, a little miffed at how enthralled they were in their work and how disinterested they were in both me and my food. I cleared my throat and leaned into the room a bit, trying to sneak a glance at one of the papers. The schematics didn't make much sense to me, and there were several drawings of animals scattered around as well. "So, what exactly are you making?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, when Stella looked up at me. She sighed as though she knew I wasn't going to leave them alone because Macy was there. "It's a device capable of administering CPR to several different small animals," Stella said. "The only problem is creating the part of it that can adjust based on the animal." Macy was still looking at the papers, but when she heard Stella talking about it, she looked up at me too, and it made my heartbeat quicken. "Yes," Macy said, "and integrating the database of CPR information to the interface will be difficult as well. But I believe it is possible for us to do it. It will just take a lot of hard work." "Oh," I said, "that is interesting. However, I have spent the last 2 hours slaving over my cutting board and a very hot oven for the two of you, so I would really appreciate it if you would come at least try a bite before getting back to your lair." "It's not a lair, Dad," Stella said, sighing and standing up, pushing her chair out behind her. "We're not supervillains. We're scientists. It's a lab." Macy followed Stella's lead and stood up to leave, smiling when Stella said that they were both scientists. I found myself unable to tear my eyes away from her smile and I remembered for a moment the way she had looked before our junior year of high school, when she had still had braces, filling up her mouth and widening her smile. Stella and Macy sat at the table, and I brought out the vegan ratatouille that I had constructed. It wasn't necessarily specially vegan. Ratatouille was already a vegan dish. I also produced a baguette that I had just pulled from the oven. I sliced it and presented the food to them at the table, finishing everything off with a quick drizzle of olive oil. "Wow," Macy said after taking her first bite. She covered her mouth with her hand and made eye contact with me. I could feel Stella watching us. "This is spectacular." "Thank you," I said, feeling a blush climbing my cheeks. I felt Stella looking at me and tried to ignore the feeling. I cleared my throat. I actually went ahead and made a vegan meal because I wasn't sure. I remember in high school, you were vegetarian. "No, yeah," Macy said, her mouth still slightly stuffed with food, as she waved her fork around emphatically. "I love cheese too much to be vegan. I should, really, but vegetarian is better than nothing, right?" "Right," Stella said, glancing down at her food with a curious look. I could already see the wheels turning in her head, and I felt a thrum of dread in my stomach. Stella was going to try and convince me to go vegetarian with her. "You should open a restaurant," Macy said, still eating heaping bites of the dish. "This is so amazing. And the way this town is growing, I would be willing to bet a nice restaurant is just about in line. You should get a foot in the door before the big-name chains come sliding in." "No," I laughed. "Sometimes dreams are just dreams." Macy rolled her eyes and took another helping, and I glanced over at Stella, who was still watching us intently. She had only just finished her plate, and I hoped that her natural aversion to vegetables would be enough to keep the steak in our house. "To some, dreams are only goals," Macy said, swallowing another bite. I might be quoting someone, I don't know. Have you actually thought about it? All I know is this is the right time to start a restaurant, and you could totally do it, you know? I shrugged and crossed my arms. I have a job, and Stella, I can take care of myself. And new businesses almost always start in the negative, and I am just not in a place to handle that. It's just a dream, and that's okay. I can cook here. I gestured to the table and realized the three of us had finished off the entire dish. I stood up and began gathering up the dishes. And besides, after Stella's new gadget takes off, we won't need any extra money. Macy stood too. "Please, let me help with the dishes." "It's all yours," Stella said, putting her hands up and slipping out of her chair and out of the room. She darted out before I could tell her to stay and help clean. But Macy waved after her as though she was telling me it was okay. "I haven't done dishes with anyone in a long time," she said as she carried her stack of dishes to the sink. I began filling the sink with the water and watched it swell against the sides. Macy disappeared and came back with our glasses. "That's what it feels like for me too," I said, nodding loosely in Stella's direction. Macy laughed, and I felt accomplished, and once I started washing the dishes, we fell into a rhythm, me scrubbing and rinsing, Macy drying, and almost intuitively knowing where each dish went. "So, nobody else in the picture then?" I asked, hearing my own heavy voice break in the middle of the sentence. "What?" Macy turned around and looked at me. She was stretching to put one of the glasses away, and as she turned to look at me, her blouse stretched over her chest, showing the swell of her breast. Her loose curls fell over her shoulder haphazardly, and I had to actively keep myself from following the curls of her hair down to her back, then to the curve of her hip. "Oh," I said, clearing my throat and ripping my eyes away. "You said you haven't done dishes with another person in a while, I think." "Oh," Macy said, coming back to me and picking up a new dish. She began to dry it, and I could feel the heat radiating off her through her skirt and blouse. She was kind of staring off into the distance as she twisted her hand in the glass, drying the inside. "Yes, nobody else in the picture. I worked really hard in the city to get my company off the ground. I didn't really have time for anything else, really." There was a short silence. Then she looked up at me and asked, "What about you?" "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "since Stella's mom passed?" "Oh," Macy said, "I'm sorry." "It's been 5 years," I said, then cleared my throat. "I know it still hurts, especially for Stella. But it's not nearly as bad as it was when it first happened." "I don't know what to say. To lose your wife like that." "We weren't married," I said, cutting her off. She looked at me, her eyebrows shooting up in surprise. "I mean, you know my parents." I wanted to be absolutely sure before I married her, you know? Turns out I waited too long. Macy didn't say anything for a moment, and I realized we had washed and dried all the dishes in record time. I pulled the plug and rinsed my sudsy hands off and watched the water swirl down the drain. I thought about going over to Macy's house every day after school because I could not stand to be in my own, where my parents were sure to be fighting or passively aggressively ignoring each other, the air in the house frigid and unwelcoming. Marriage is not synonymous with love, Macy said finally. Just because you didn't marry her doesn't mean your time together means anything less. I know that, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. I looked up at Macy, searching her eyes, wondering if our time together in high school meant anything less, because I never told her I loved her. But it's nice to hear it. We stood in silence for another moment, and I wanted nothing more than to pull her close and hold her against me so I could feel her curves against my body. Instead, I cleared my throat and walked out of the kitchen so I could see into the living room. Sure enough, Stella was curled up on the couch, the lights of the TV flashing over her face. I felt Macy come to stand next to me, and I grabbed a blanket from the recliner, spreading it over her like I had so many nights before. Stella squirmed a bit, but stilled. Every day she looked more and more like her mother. I gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, then jumped as a loud crash came from the other room.
Chapter 5. I had wandered away to give Brad time to reminisce, looking at pictures on the walls, and suddenly I had to slap my hand to my mouth to keep from screaming as a vase on the table toppled to the ground, shattering and arcing through the room, covering the tile in glistening glass shards. I was standing next to a table near the door, and though the pictures framed there were out in the open, I could not push away the feeling that I had been snooping through Brad and Stella's private affairs. For a moment, my heart stood still as the glass was spraying across the floor. Then it picked back up and began hammering rapidly in my chest. My eyes immediately darted back to the picture of Brad, Stella, and a woman I could only assume was her mom. They were all sitting together on a bench, and Stella had her hands cupped, filled with snow. Brad and the woman were wearing red sweaters, and Stella was wearing a red dress with white cuffs. They were a cute, coordinated family. Brad was laughing and looking at his daughter, and her mother was looking right at the camera. She was thin and blonde and smiling widely with slightly crooked white teeth. She almost reminded me of Elizabeth, but there was something very different about her. I tried to remember her from high school, but I could not. I didn't know if that was because she wasn't there or because I hadn't paid enough attention. I wondered what it was that had pushed this seemingly happy woman to do what she did, especially when she had Brad and Stella sitting next to her and smiling like that. And then I shook my head and tried to remember that it doesn't always matter what a person has. Most people's pain came from somewhere within. The woman in the picture gave me a reproving look, and I stared back at her for a moment, trying to understand her. I heard Brad from the other room and realized he must have heard the crashing vase, and that he was probably on his way to see what happened. I took a breath and tried to move, but felt a prick in my foot and winced, knowing that I probably had a few slivers of glass lodged in my bare feet. It was probably best not to move, or I would gather a few more. I could not remember the last time I had broken something that was glass, but this seemed much worse, as the floor was covered in shards shining in the light. "Are you okay?" Brad asked, standing on the other side of the wide arc of broken glass. He looked largely concerned for my safety, glancing down at the glass all around me. His brown hair was rustled and standing on end, and his eyes were dark. I wondered what he had been doing before he heard the crash. "I'm okay," I whispered, hoping the crash hadn't woken Stella. "I'm so sorry. I brushed against it and it just—" "Don't worry about it," Brad said, smiling softly at me. "It's a dollar store vase. Nothing important." He coughed. "Not that, strong men such as I keep nice vases around." I laughed and he disappeared for a moment, returning with heavy work boots on his feet. Carefully, he swept up the larger shards around me. I stood still, occasionally glancing down at my white-painted toenails and the trail of blood leaking down the side of my foot, where a shard had lodged itself. Brad swept the area a few times, then ran a piece of bread all around me, then mopped it and ran a paper towel over the area. He seemed to be practiced in cleaning up broken glass, and I watched as he worked methodically, his face set. When he had finished, he rocked back on his feet and looked up at me. I felt like I was posing for a portrait, as I hadn't moved in 15 minutes. We locked eyes and stayed there for a moment, just looking at each other. Then he stood and brushed his hands off, though there was nothing on them. "I think you will be okay to move now," he said. "If there are any shards of glass left, they're probably out of the country by now." I laughed and tried to take a step forward, but winced when it put pressure on the shard of glass that had lodged itself in my foot. It was a particular, stabbing kind of pain, like something interjecting itself into your life and refusing to leave. "Oh, hey," Brad said, seeing me wince, glancing down and seeing the blood. "Come here. We'll get that right out." I followed him to the bathroom, wincing with each step. He instructed me to sit on the edge of the very clean bathtub, and he sat on the toilet, taking my foot in his lap. I balanced precariously between the 2 points, and he held my ankle with one hand, running his tanned hand over my pale foot lightly. The contrast between the two was startling, and I had to hold back a gasp as the touch sent shivers up my back. "Right here," he murmured, taking a pair of tweezers and gently removing the shard, admittedly without much pain. I watched as the shard came out, appearing as though it was just a sparkling piece of air, refracting in the light. Almost beautiful. The act of it still dizzied me, however, and I looked away from his hands as he smoothly pressed Band-Aid to the wound. His hands were warm and my foot was cold, and he held his hand there for a moment, making my skin prick up and down my arms and legs. He cleared his throat and pulled his hand away, looking away from me and gently placing my foot on the ground. The air was still, and I wished desperately I could know what he was thinking, but looking at his calm facial expression didn't reveal anything. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you some painkiller." I followed him to the dining room, and he produced a bottle of wine, pouring each of us a glass. I took mine and swirled it around, watching the blood-red liquid briefly stain the glass before running back down. Everyone in California had loved to drink wine. It was almost a feature at every party, and I had almost gotten used to it, but it wasn't my favorite. I desperately wished it was classy for grown women to sip chocolate milk from fancy glasses, but unfortunately it was not. I could feel Brad watching me, so I looked up at him, hoping to meet his brown eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked after I had taken a sip. "Yes," I said, laughing gently. "I think I'll live." After a moment, I asked, "Are you okay?" He gave me a curious look, and I tried not to reveal that I already knew Stella's mother was dead, and how she had died. "Yeah," he said. "Why? Do I seem not okay?" "No, that's not it. I sighed. "I was looking at the pictures on your mantel near the door." "Yeah," he said, sipping on his wine. "That's Casey Lee, Stella's mother." He paused for a moment and looked out the window. "I've been thinking about her a lot lately, especially because Stella's been acting out. I don't know if that's why. I mean, I can't think of any other reason. I'm just trying to be patient with her." He looked pained for a moment. "She just looks so much like her, more and more every day." He said a lot more than I thought he was going to, and we sat in silence for a moment. I listened to the sound of him breathing and tried to think of something to say to that. I could not tell him why Stella wasn't behaving the way people wanted her to. I wasn't anything like her, especially not in high school, and I didn't know her mother, or what it was like to lose one. I swallowed, hard, and tried to change the subject. "A lot of things have changed since we were in high school." "You're right," Brad said, taking another drink of his wine. His glass was already empty, and he poured himself another one. "I thought you would never come back. And I thought if you did come back, it would definitely be with a husband. A family." "Not a wife?" I asked, glibly. He laughed, then shook his head. "Seriously, though," he said, "you just left. You know most people wait until after the summer to leave, right? Like, you were there at graduation and then just gone. And you didn't say anything. Not to anyone. not even to me. I swallowed, hard, remembering the way I had felt then. I hated the small town. I hated the way the people made me feel. I had my degree in hand and I was ready to leave. Also, I was in love with Brad, and he had no interest in me. After his injury, he had no interest in anyone, and without him, I had no reason to stay in the town a moment longer. "I'm sorry," I said. "My apartment lease in California started in the summer and—" "No," Brad said, waving his hand. "I mean, I am not upset about it now. It was so long ago." We sat silently for a moment, then Brad cleared his throat and refilled his wine glass again. "So how was college?" he asked, and I was reminded again that he didn't get the chance to go. I ran my finger around the rim of my glass a few times and thought about my years in college, realizing they were mostly the same as my years in high school. "It was good," I said. "I graduated top of my class. I just kind of kept my head down and focused on my studies. I got to work in a lab my junior year, and that really sparked some of my ideas for Excel. I developed a more efficient source of fuel for some of the machines we used in the labs where I worked. And when I sold the patent, I made enough money to start Excel." Brad was nodding, but his eyes were heavily lidded and he was staring down at his wine dazedly. I watched him carefully, watched his strong hands, and remembered the way his hand would brush mine, and the tingles that would race up my arm. I wanted to reach out and touch his hand just to see if that electricity was still there. I tried to remember the last time I'd been touched by someone, and I had to think back at least a year. Someone in town for a conference, someone I was sure I would never see again. He had found me and called me, but I blocked him. I had no interest in a relationship. I took another sip of my wine, still studying Brad's hand where it rested on the table. My eyes moved from his hands and drank in his wrist. Then I looked up, past his strong forearm and to his shoulder. His t-shirt fell nicely over his collarbone, and his neck emerged from his collar, smooth and tan. I wished I could see the chest underneath it, but instead I moved up, past his stubbled cheeks to his dark brown eyes. "Macy," he said, his voice rough around the edges. Something heavy was in his voice, and my heart jumped in anticipation of what he might say. He blinked heavily and looked back down at his drink, as though he had forgotten what he was going to say. "Brad," I said, standing and looking down at my glass, which I hadn't even finished drinking. He was looking at it too, as though he wanted to finish it. "I think I had better be going." He nodded and stood, buzzed but not drunk. I walked to the door and he walked with me. I turned around. "Thank you for the food," I said, "and the wine." "It means a lot to her that you came," Brad said, looking toward the living room and blinking slowly. "So, thank you." "Your daughter is a bright girl," I said, smiling and slipping my purse into the crick of my arm. "It's a pleasure to get to work with her. I'll see you both later." I opened the door and put my hand on the screen door. I glanced back to say a final goodnight, and Brad gently took my chin, kissing me on the cheek. My stomach melted. My knees felt weak, and I had to grip onto the door handle. "Good night, Macy," he said, his eyes rich and dark. I tried to reply, but found the words stuck in my throat, so I just nodded and closed the door, hoping he could not see the way the blood rushed to my cheeks when he touched me.
Chapter 6. The sun was far too bright and shining directly into my face. I groaned and rolled over, throwing my arm over my face in an attempt to block out the annoying rays. I had almost fallen back asleep when I realized the sunlight meant it was morning, and it being morning was troubling, because that was the same time of the day that I needed to be getting up and ready for work. I jerked and sat up, my heart racing as I looked over at the clock and realized I was going to be late to work. And if Stella wasn't up, she definitely was going to be late for school. Normally in the morning I woke her up, but occasionally she was awake before me. I hoped this was one of those days. I threw the duvet off of my legs and scrambled to my feet, snagging a pair of jeans from the floor and yanking them on, one leg at a time as I hobbled to the door. "Stella!" I shouted. I was slipping a shirt over my head when she came running into the hallway, a hairbrush in one hand and her toothbrush sticking out of her mouth. Her hair was wild, and her eyes were wide and panicked. For a moment, I was reminded of the night that her mother had given birth, when her hair was crazy, and we were both trying to find the car keys, and nothing was going right until Stella was born. She tried to say something, but her toothbrush moved around and a line of toothpaste trailed from the corner of her mouth. She yanked the toothbrush from her mouth and shook her head wildly, fixing me with an accusatory stare. "We're going to be late," she said, then sprinted back down the hallway, still in the clothes she had been wearing the day before. 2 minutes later, she reemerged, her hair brushed and in a ponytail. She was in a new outfit as I pulled 2 pieces of toast from the toaster. I paused for a moment to wonder how it was that she had all the clothes she had, though I hadn't bought any of them for her. I slapped peanut butter on one and handed it to her as she went out the door, then did the same to the second and crammed it in my mouth as I ran out the door, locking it behind me. Of course, we weren't the only late people, and we had to fight with the traffic to get on the highway, and then again to get back off. Stella was fidgeting in the seat next to me, running her hands over her pants and chewing on her fingers. I wondered why it was that she was suddenly concerned about being late, when previously she hadn't seemed to care. I wondered if it was because of Macy. Macy, who had only been late to class once in her entire school career that I knew of. And it was because of me. I hadn't intended to fall asleep, face down on the floor of her room, but she had been reading to me and her voice was smooth, calm, and even, lulling me to sleep. I had woken up in the middle of the night, and thinking I was in my own room, I had crawled into bed with her. I had also bumped into the alarm clock. So when Macy's crazy brain woke her up 20 minutes after her alarm was supposed to go off, she realized it had come unplugged. She had wasted no time pushing me out of the bed and scrambling to get dressed, shouting directions to me as she went. We were in the car 5 minutes later, and we were only a minute late. Linda probably would have written it off for Macy if she had been by herself, but she was with me, and Linda would rather punish me by punishing her than go easy on Macy. I thought about how Macy hadn't talked to me for a week after that, and how her parents wouldn't let me in to see her, saying she wasn't feeling well when I knew full well that she was pissed with me. It had taken 3 new books to get her to talk to me again. Though I drove faster than the speed limit the entire way to the high school, we still managed to get there half an hour after the first bell. We had to wait a moment to be buzzed through the doors, and then when we made it into the office, Linda looked up at us with disdain. Her hair was gray, her lipstick was layered on thick, and I didn't know that we had ever seen her real skin tone, because it was buried under a thick slathering of foundation. Linda hadn't liked me when I was in high school, as I often snuck past her through the doors when I wasn't supposed to. I always led the other kids in, sneaking through back doors and climbing in through open windows, and she liked to know about every single person who came in. The new buzzer system was perfect for her. "You're late," she said, not looking at Stella, and instead looking at me. I cleared my throat and glanced at Stella, who motioned to her teeth quickly enough that the secretary didn't see the movement. For a moment, I wasn't sure what it was that she was trying to tell me. Then it clicked, and I felt as though we were collaborating a heist. "She had a dentist's appointment?" I said, clearing my throat. Stella nodded when Linda looked at her and smiled bright and wide, as though Linda would be able to tell by looking at her teeth. Linda looked between the two of us for a moment, and I remembered each and every time in high school when she had examined me from head to toe, scrutinizing me and trying to get me to reveal that I had been lying the whole time. She looked as though she was about to call us out on our lie, but another person entered the office. Stella and I looked over to see Macy standing just inside the doorway, a stack of papers in her hand. She was wearing a polka-dotted blouse and form-fitting black pants, and I had to work hard not to trace the curves of her form with my eyes. Her smell wafted through the room right away, something like vanilla essence, and I wondered how it was that she had smelled the same since high school. We looked at her, stunned, but Macy just shuffled the papers in her hand, glancing down at them as she moved to the counter above where Linda was sitting. She perched an elbow on the counter and brushed her hair away from her face daintily. "Hey, Linda," she said, smiling at Linda and earning one back. "I have some flyers with information about the scholarship and requirements and whatnot. Is it okay if I leave them here on the counter?" Linda nodded at her, then looked back at Stella and me, but Macy turned to us before Linda could get a word out. "Stella, how did that appointment go?" she asked. "Any cavities?" I stared at her, shocked. But Stella was much more astute than me and shook her head, flashing Macy the same smile she had shown to Linda. "Nope, clean bill of teeth," As usual, Stella said, grinning at Macy as though she was her own personal hero. That's good, Macy said, winking at us, before nodding at Linda and leaving the office. When I had recovered from her sudden appearance and heroic scene, I realized Linda was holding out a late pass for Stella. Thank you, Stella said, taking it and hurrying out the door. Linda shook her head and looked back at her computer. You should tell us about appointments the day before so we can have a late pass ready for you, she said, glancing up at me. Smiling slightly, she said, You'd better go, though, because I can't give you one of these. Shocked and still dumbfounded as to how Linda had smiled at me, I nodded at her and smiled back before hurrying out of the office and back to my Kia. Traffic was terrible all the way to the mechanic shop, and by the time I got there, I was a full hour late to work. I hurried inside and clocked in quickly. I was in the middle of yanking my coveralls on when the door to the locker room slammed open and Georgie stepped inside. She was wiping her hands on an oiled rag, and she eyed me up and down, then pointedly looked at the clock. When she looked back at me, I knew she had said all she needed to without saying a word. I know, I said, closing my locker quickly. I'll stay an hour late. I am sorry, Stella was late to work. I mean school. Georgie raised her eyebrows, and the bandana on her head moved with it. Okay, I said. I woke up late, and that's why we were late, but I won't let it happen again. Promise. Georgie rolled her eyes and stepped aside so I could get into the shop. I go way too easy on you, she said as I walked past her. I turned around and held my hands up together like I was praying to show how much I appreciated her. She rolled her eyes at me again as the door shut behind me. Hours later, smelling of motor oil and feeling like it too, I pulled into our driveway and stumbled through the door. Stella was sitting at the table, her head bent over some papers. I recognized them as the flyers that Macy had stacked in the office that morning. I got a glass of milk and sat down at the table with her, raising my eyebrows at the paper when she looked up at me. It's information about the scholarship, Stella said. There's no minimum cumulative GPA. I stared at her over the top of my milk glass, and she continued. Which is good because, although my GPA isn't terrible, it's not like I am a 4.0 student or anything like that. It's just a good idea because it means that anybody can win now. Not only people have been doing well previously, like it's okay to turn it around or whatever, I nodded at her, realizing that her mother had always been the one who checked on her schoolwork to make sure she was keeping up, and I hadn't checked it once after she passed. I cleared my throat and sat up straight in my chair, realizing that not once had I demanded to see a report card or a grade on a paper. I am doing fine, Stella said, not looking up from the paper. I didn't know if she got it from her mother, but she seemed to have the uncanny quality of being able to know what I was thinking before I even spoke. I am a freshman in high school now. I should be able to take care of myself. Oh, thank God, I said, laughing and standing up from the table. That means I can go now, right? Mexico. Here I come. Stella rolled her eye and highlighted something on the page, not even acknowledging my little joke. I have to create a presentation for my science project, she said. I think I could get Macy to help with that too, because the presentation she put together for the assembly at our school was so good. Yeah, she owns a company, so I guess she'd be pretty good at that stuff, I said, rinsing out my glass and setting it to the side of the sink. Though there was so much about Macy that hadn't changed, there was a lot that had changed too. The Macy that came into the office and effortlessly included herself in our lie was not the same one that I had known in high school. The shy, well-mannered Macy I had known in high school would never have lied, and especially not to Linda. You guys knew each other in high school, right? Stella asked, now doodling at the bottom of the sheet in front of her. Yeah, I said as I started pulling out the ingredients I would need to make supper. We didn't have many groceries left, but I had to wait until I got paid to buy more. We were pretty good friends. Did she seem like the kind of person who was going to do great stuff with her life? Stella asked, not looking at me. I stopped for a moment, a box of spaghetti in my hand, and watched her, trying to understand what it was that was fueling this interrogation. I tried to figure out what it was that she wanted to hear from me, then decided to just go with the truth. Yeah, I said, setting a pot of water on the stove to boil. She was driven and smart. Oh, Stella said, what about me? Do you think I am driven and smart? I stopped what I was doing and turned around. Now she was looking at me, her eyes wide and accepting, as though if I told her she was lazy and stupid, she would actually believe me. I cleared my throat and wished Casey Lee was here, because she would have known exactly what to say to Stella to clear up her doubts. Macy told me the other night that you are a very bright girl, I said, turning back to the stove, as though it was an afterthought. She said she was excited to work with you. Really? Stella said, her voice high and hopeful. Really, I said. I shook the noodles into the boiling water and turned around again, expecting to have a heart-warming embrace with her. But she just mumbled something that sounded like, "Okay, cool," and gathered her papers up, hurrying to her room and closing the door behind her.
Chapter 7. Mrs. Davis, I said, entering one of the science classrooms between periods and finding the teacher behind her desk. I had been briefly acquainted with her when I had met all of the science teachers, but I hadn't gotten a chance to really talk to the woman. She stood up when I came in, and I noticed she was reading through a manual for the new smart boards I had installed in all of the teachers' rooms. Some of the teachers, particularly the older ones, had scoffed and grumbled as they were being installed, and I knew that many of the manuals hadn't even been taken out of their plastic sleeves. "Did you get the new equipment that came in?" I asked Mrs. Davis. "Yes," she said, standing and hurrying to the back of her classroom. "I got the delivery this morning, but I haven't opened many of the boxes. I am going to have some of the kids come and help me after class." "Oh, good," I said, seeing the boxes were stacked nicely in her supply closet. "I would also have the kids help you clear out some of that old equipment. Of course, you can keep anything you'd like, but ideally, we'll be replacing everything. So clearing it out now might give you more space to work." "Right," she said, looking into the closet once more, then shutting the door. "Did all of these classrooms get this new equipment?" "Yes," I said, making eye contact with her and softly clapping my hands together. "Some of the classrooms are receiving materials more specific to their topics, but generally all of the classrooms are getting new equipment." "That's amazing," she said. "I can't imagine how you're doing all this. It's astounding." "Well, I am happy to do it, you know," I said, happy she was one of the teachers that supported what I was doing. "I wish I had these opportunities when I was in school. Did you read through the email I sent you about opportunities for learning activities?" "Yes," Mrs. Davis said, "and I love it. I can't wait until the kids get to go and do these things." I smiled at her enthusiasm. "We are looking at starting the field trips next month and continuing them throughout the school year. Of course, the things I sent you are only suggestions. If you have any ideas for field trips, just write them up and send them to me, and we will see what we can do." Mrs. Davis thanked me as the kids for the next class started filing in. I nodded respectfully to her before slipping out quietly. On my way out, my phone started ringing, and I picked it up when I saw that it was Elizabeth. "Hey," I said, slipping into the bathroom to talk to her. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," she said. "Everything is good here. I just hadn't heard from you in a while. Wanted to make sure things there are going well." "As well as possible," I said. When another girl came into the bathroom giving me a look, I cleared my throat. "Hey, listen, I am going to have to give you a call back later, okay?" "Wow, I see how it is," she said. "You moved to the big little town and suddenly you don't have time for little old me." "Ha," I said, slipping out of the bathroom and back into the hallway. "I'll talk to you later." I made my way down the hallway toward my room and scanned the ocean of heads. The kids had started becoming accustomed to seeing me around the school, and a few of them had even started waving to me in the hallways. I almost never saw Stella, however, and I kept a keen watch for her as I moved through the hallways, my eyes scanning over numerous blonde heads, looking for the one that led to the girl with earbuds and an old t-shirt, but she was nowhere to be seen. I had almost made it back to my classroom when I did see someone I knew, standing just outside the door to my room. His shoulders were far above most of the other people in the hallway, and he was looking around as though he was lost and in danger of being washed up and swallowed whole by the ocean of students. His brown hair was brushed back and, for once, neat-looking. I marveled in the fact that I could see him, but he could not see me. "Can I help you?" I said as I neared him. He turned, and I was suddenly assaulted with the memory of the kiss he planted on my cheek the week before, when I had been over to help Stella with her project. I had to clear my throat and brush my hair out of my face to keep my mind focused on the man in front of me, rather than his memory. "Stella is homesick today," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. She wanted me to come in. She said you have some things that she needs to use for her project. Something that would have been delivered to your office? I studied him carefully. A package had arrived at my office the day before, but I had no idea what was inside or where it had come from, so I had tossed it aside, too busy with other things. I wondered if perhaps Stella had told him of the package's contents, or if he was just blindly following her orders. Yes, I have it. Follow me, I said, ushering him into the office. It was cool in the room, and I could see Brad visibly relax when the air conditioning hit him. My office was neat and tidy, and when I sat down, I pulled out the bottom drawer and easily found the package. I showed it to Brad, and he shrugged. Is that it? I don't know, I said, dropping the package on the table. I didn't order it. Stella must have ordered it herself to be delivered to my office without my permission. Oh, Brad said, rubbing the back of his neck again. His face flushed red and he looked down at the package. I am sure it's nothing bad. I am sorry about this. Just, if you're going to give her a detention, please wait to do it until the end of the week, please. I don't know that Georgie is going to let me off the hook if I have to leave again. I stared at him, baffled. I glanced down at the package and then back at him, shaking my head and beginning to chuckle. I am not going to give her a detention, I said, astonished that he would just assume that was the first course of action. Honestly, I am not sure that I have that power, and if I did, I most certainly wouldn't use it. I am not going to give her a detention. I just don't see a reason for her to be paying for something when I can handle it for her. I can't imagine she has the largest disposable income. No, Brad said. I suppose not. He visibly deflated when he heard me say that I wasn't going to give her a detention, and I wondered how a nice girl like Stella managed to gather so many punishments anyway. I was also curious to know which teachers were always giving them to her. They had to have some sympathy for what had happened to her mother, didn't they? Well, Brad said, when it was clear I had retreated into my own thoughts for the moment. Thanks for this. Whatever it is, I am sure it's important. He picked the package up and held it lightly in his hands, like he was worried the whole thing might spontaneously catch on fire. Knowing Stella, I suppose it was possible. Wait, I said, stopping him as he was on his way to the door. I stood up and hurried over to him, suddenly feeling like it was impossible not to be near him. Do you know how to use that? Does Stella? Well, he said, regarding the package again. I don't know. I don't know what it is, so I am not really sure if I know how to use it or not. He trailed off as I took the package from him and felt the weight in my hand, trying to figure out what it was. I realized how closely we were standing after a moment, and my breathing quickened, knowing his heart was beating only a breath away from mine. I think I had better come over and help her with it, I said, finally, handing it back to him. Our hands brushed, and those electric tingles that had always run up my arms came racing back, jumping right to my heart and my stomach, scorching me inside and out. I wondered if my hair was standing on end. If you want to, he said, I'll have to figure out how to impress you with supper again. I smiled at him and wanted to tell him that his statement almost sounded like we would be going on a date with each other, rather than me coming over to help his daughter with her project and eat a meal with the both of them. But before I could get a word out, something changed in his eyes and he took a step forward, nearly pushing me right up against the edge of my desk. I instinctively put my hands on his chest to steady myself, and I could feel each of his heavy breaths on my cheeks as he looked down at me, heat in his eyes. Brad, I said, my voice a whisper. I worried for a moment that I was going to confess to him not only the embarrassing crush I had on him in high school, but the growing attraction I was finding it harder and harder to ignore every time we were near one another. It was like the time we had spent apart after high school had only heightened my body's senses for his presence. Macy, he said, and some of the heat in his eyes turned to desperation as he looked back and forth between my eyes, as though he was trying to find something there. Whatever it was he was searching for, I hoped that he would find it. Suddenly, his strong arms were on my back and he was pulling me into him, so my chest was pressed against his. I waited for his lips, but found myself stepping back, away from him, when a familiar voice called into the room. "Macy," Matt called, opening the door. Luckily, I had 2 seconds to recover and compose myself, and I hoped whatever blood had rushed to my cheeks had calmed and retreated. "I just wanted to talk to you about—" Matt looked up from his file and at Brad, who stood at least a head taller than him, and was nearly twice his width. "Matt," I hoped my voice sounded relatively normal. "This is Brad, an old friend. Brad, this is Matt, one of my coworkers. He's the biology teacher here." Brad laughed. "Certainly a step up from that other old fart, huh?" I thanked him silently with my eyes for not bringing up what might have just happened between the two of us. I also thanked circumstance that Matt hadn't just opened the door into our embrace. "Yeah," Matt said, laughing uneasily and glancing between the two of us. "I would sure hope so. Though with all the work Macy is doing throughout the school, it's hard for us not to be a step up." Brad nodded, his muscular arms crossed over his chest. I hadn't thought about it before, but he resembled the old football coach rather well, especially with the khaki shorts and button-up shirt he was wearing. Matt turned to me. "I wanted to talk to you about the schematics you sent me yesterday. I see you have decided to change the overall capacity for the interface, and I was thinking about how to code in the different information." I looked at the paper and followed Matt's fingers when he pointed to different areas of a sketch, but I could not concentrate on anything except the fact that Brad was still in my room, now leaning against the desk, watching Matt and I intently. When Matt had finished, I took the schematics from him and laid them on my desk. Part of me was hoping that Brad was going to sweep me back up in his arms and continue right where we left off, but it was clear he had lost his motivation. He passed the package from his left hand to his right hand wordlessly, then cleared his throat and looked to the door. "Well, I had better get going," he said. "I'm sure Stella is waiting for whatever this is. What time are you planning on coming tonight?" I chewed on my lip for a moment, then told him a time, and he nodded once before tightening his grip on the package and heading for the door. After it shut, I fell into my chair and let it spin around. I watched my diploma rotate around and then pass me over and over, wishing I had the guts to kiss Brad Walker myself.
Chapter 8. "Ms. Johnson," Stella said, opening the door to welcome Macy in. I tried to focus on the food I was cooking and not what had almost happened between us as she walked past the kitchen. In my pot, I had chicken stock, sautéed vegetables, chicken, and softened potatoes. I stirred it and forced my mind to focus on what it was that I would be adding to the mix next. Macy had been pressed against me only hours earlier, and all I had to do was kiss her. I had been so close to telling her how I had felt, and yet she didn't look surprised or disgusted as I held her in my arms. I thought back to the moment, and in her eyes, I could have sworn I almost saw a longing there. Of course, it was possible that I was just seeing what I wanted to see, but I brushed that thought aside and added the cream of chicken to my soup. "Dad said we could move into the living room," Stella said, sniffling as she led Macy away. I glanced back at her as she went to see that she was wearing a light blue blouse and jeans. I found my eyes wandering down, until I was staring at her ass as she walked away. I shook my head and turned around, stirring the soup and adding another pinch of salt. I could hear Stella and Macy talking in the living room, and I had bit my tongue as Stella taped pictures up around the room for them to look at as they worked, because she had convinced me it was for science and for the animals. When the soup was assembled, I could not think of any reason to stand there while it simmered. So I wandered over to the doorway to the living room and watched Stella and Macy as they sat on the floor, drawing up different schematics and debating the logistics of each design. Macy pulled a pen out from behind her ear and scribbled an equation down on a spare piece of notepaper, and I watched as Stella bent over, watching her intently. I thought of when Stella was little, and how Casey Lee had sat in the living room with her, night after night, drilling the alphabet. When I had tried to tell her that I didn't think kids that little learned the alphabet that early, she had whirled around and told me that she didn't want Stella to be like other kids. She wanted her to be special. She wanted her to be spectacular. I wondered how she would feel about Macy being here, about Stella so clearly seeing her as a role model. Macy was the owner of a very successful and prevalent company, and Casey Lee had been a waitress. Stella's mother was the most competitive person I had ever known, and I knew that if she was in the living room with Stella and Macy, She would be involving herself in their conversation. She would be researching their project and the information involved until she was just as knowledgeable as them about it, or until she knew more them. Suddenly, I missed Casey Lee fiercely, and though we had only gotten together because of Stella, I had still loved her as more than the mother of my daughter. I had loved her for her strong spirit, for her relentless pursuit of whatever it was that was going to make her happy, for her insistence on being the best there was. I thought of the vase that Macy had knocked off the mantel. It's true that it was a dollar store vase, but it was a vase that Casey Lee had picked out and brought home to put her flowers in. There was no real significance, no single event that tied that vase to her. But I suddenly noticed the place on the mantel where it used to be. "Dad!" Stella shouted from the living room. "Is supper almost finished?" I started and hurried back to the kitchen, realizing I had left the soup on the stove and hadn't stirred it once since I had set it to simmer. When I got to it, it was still fine and nearly ready, so I popped the rolls into the oven and called back to Stella that it would be finished soon. I wandered back to the doorway to the living room and watched Stella and Macy, now piecing things together to build a prototype that looked fairly good for being the first one. I wondered if Stella would be a different person if Casey Lee hadn't left us, and for the 100th time, I wondered what I could have done differently to keep Casey Lee around. Stella and I had seen counselors extensively after her mom passed away, and the counselor had made a point of me knowing that Casey Lee's actions were not mine, and that I could not keep a sick woman from acting out of illness. I wondered if I had ever internalized that, and if Stella's counselor had told her the same thing. And then, of course, my mind wandered back to the thing I least liked to think about. Casey Lee had never been my wife, and when people in the community consoled me for my loss, they always used the word wife. But I wouldn't marry her, and of course, that led me back to wondering if there was anything I could have done differently to keep her with us. "Hey," I said, when the timer for the rolls went off, "why don't you guys move to the dining room? I'll bring the food in." Stella looked up at me, her blue eyes bright like her mother's. Macy looked up at me too, and I got stuck on her dark green eyes. I wondered what my life would be like if I had gotten over myself in high school and told her how I felt about her. Would we be married? Would I be struggling to pay for the mortgage on the house? I pushed the thoughts away because, as much as those things sounded nice, I knew a reality, with only Macy pushed out, the possibility of Stella being with me. And she was the person I cared most about in the world. I ladled the soup into bowls and placed the rolls on the sides of the bowls and brought it to the dining room where Macy and Stella were sitting, still talking excitedly about the project. I numbly served the food and sat there silently as they ate and continued talking. A few times, I caught Macy glancing over at me worriedly, the way she had after I had gotten hurt senior year. I remembered her visiting me in the hospital the day before I was to have surgery. I was laid up on the pillows and I had been so excited to see her. I thought that she would be the sunshine I needed to get through the dark time, and that I would be able to get back to the field with her support. "Maybe this isn't the worst thing," she had said, sitting at my bedside and not looking at me. "Maybe football isn't your future, as much as you want to believe it." I remembered getting angry with her, screaming at her to get out. "We're not all like you," I remembered yelling. "We don't all understand everything we read. We won't all get scholarships. Football is all I have, so fuck you." My spoon clanked against the side of the bowl, and I looked down, realizing I had finished my soup and was scraping at an empty bowl. When I looked up, Stella was gone, and Macy was looking at me worriedly. "Where's Stella?" I asked, looking around. "She went to the bathroom," Macy said, then lacing her hands together, she leaned forward and looked me in the eyes. "Brad, is everything okay? You seem a little bit off today." "I am fine," I said, not meeting her eyes. "I am just tired." She didn't say anything more, and I stood, taking the empty dishes to the sink. When Stella emerged from the bathroom, I told her that she was on dish duty and disappeared to my room. Inside, it was dark, and I fell into the duvet, thinking about the time when Casey Lee would have been next to me, and thinking about the beautiful woman in my living room that I had never confessed my feelings to. The next morning came too early, and the fog that had settled over me the night before was still lingering as I got up and made my coffee. Stella emerged 20 minutes later, but said nothing as we shared an omelet. She was used to the moods that I sometimes got in, and silently stabbed at the eggs until it was time for us to leave. I floated through work, and Georgie went easy on me. The mechanic shop was always busy on Fridays because people often realized that if they didn't get their car fixed, they would have to wait until the weekend was over. I focused on my work, immersing myself in gaskets and cracked hoses until Georgie gently placed a hand on my arm and told me it was time for me to go home. Stella was waiting in front of the school for me when I pulled up, one hand on the strap of her backpack, the other holding her phone. Earbuds snaked from her phone and up under her hair, startlingly white against the dark gray of her shirt. "Hey," she said when she got in the car. I felt the familiar pull to watch for Macy, but fought against it, instead pulling out of the parking lot without even glancing toward the building. Stella slowly pulled her seatbelt on, and when I realized I hadn't replied to her, I cleared my throat. "Hey," I said, how was school?" "It was okay," she said. "How was wallowing in your own despair?" I cracked a smile and looked over at her to let her know her humor was appreciated. As we drove, I realized the season had changed without me even noticing. The trees were tinged yellow, the air was threatening chill and brisk breezes. "Oh," I said, lightning as usual?" Stella laughed and sighed into her seat. I was taking her to see her grandma, which I did every last Friday of the month. Casey Lee's mother was wealthy and particular, and had stopped talking to Casey Lee when she had gotten pregnant with Stella. After the funeral, she had approached us, taking Stella in an embrace. It seemed to me that all of us were realizing Stella was all we had left of Casey Lee. Stella seemed indifferent to the fact, and I wondered how a teenage girl could show so much resilience. Around us, the houses morphed slowly, gaining levels and pools and expert landscaping. We pulled into the half-circle drive, and Stella took a deep breath. "I'll see you Monday, Dad," she said. "I think I'll go crazy not being able to work on my project while I'm here." "Enjoy your tea and crumpets," I said as Stella climbed out of the car and her grandmother came bustling out of the house, draped in a flowery silk scarf and laden with jewelry. She hugged Stella and waved to me as I pulled away. I began to drive home, but the closer I got, the more dread stacked up in my stomach until I could not take it anymore. I turned a few streets early and ended up at a hole-in-the-wall bar. I got out of the car and was thankful for the fact that the sun was setting. I didn't like the feeling of going into a bar when the sun was still shining. Inside, it was dark and comforting, and I slid onto one of the bar stools, ordering a Jack and Coke. It didn't take me long to finish it and ask for another, and that one went quickly too. I had just finished my third when I heard a familiar voice. I turned around to see Macy, sitting in one of the booths in the corner of the room. She was in her work clothes, a green blouse with sheer sleeves and those black pants that hugged her form. Her hair was curlier than normal, and it struggled to fall free of its place from behind her ear. She was looking up at a man who had his hand on the wall above her head and was leaning over the top of her. Though I had just finished my drink, I felt adrenaline coursing through my veins, lighting my arms and fists on fire. In one move, I was on my feet, then I shook my head and told myself to sit down. Macy didn't belong to me. She could flirt with whoever she pleased. I was going to turn around when I caught a snippet of their conversation. "Why don't you just come home with me?" "I've already told you I am not doing that." I turned and looked, watching Macy, her head tipped up. And even though the guy was leaning over the top of her, she was clearly dominant in the interaction. I sat back and took a sip of my drink, watching. "There's no reason to be such a bitch about it," the guy said. "I already bought you some drinks. I can't control what you do. Now, I am going to go back to enjoying my drink in silence, thank you." Macy turned away from him and wrapped her hand around her glass to take another sip. I watched, astonished, as the guy reached down and grabbed the same glass, trying to grab it from her. "Hey," I said, standing and moving over to their table. But I didn't get there in time, because Macy let go of the glass, and the drink lurched from the cup, sloshing over the sides and soaking the man's white shirt. He stood there for a moment, shocked, then shook his head in a rage. "You bitch," he said, raising the arm with the cup like he was going to throw it at her. He didn't get the chance to, however, because I grabbed his wrist and yanked until he dropped the glass on the ground and twisted around to face me. Before he could retaliate or even realize what was going on, I punched him in the nose. He staggered back, clearly too drunk to fight back. "You were going to throw a drink at a woman because she told you no?" I asked, clenching my teeth and rearing to punch him again. The bartender was coming over, and I knew that if I was going to punch him again, I would have to do it quickly. Macy put her hand on my arm, and I jumped, not realizing she had stood. "It's not worth it, Brad," she said, tugging on my arm. Then to the bartender, she said, "I'm sorry, we're leaving." "You should probably get someone to fix this guy's nose up, though. He's always in here bothering people," the bartender said. "I am just glad this guy was here to step in before something really awful happened." Macy nodded and tugged on my arm harder, so I followed her, watching as the bartender lowered the guy into a seat slowly to keep him from falling over. Macy pulled me out of the building and around the corner. In the cool of the night air, I could smell her vanilla essence scent, and her eyes were shining under the light post as she looked back at me. "What were you thinking?" she started to ask, but stopped as I placed my hands on her hips and pushed her up against the brick wall, kissing her like I was making up for not kissing her in her office, for not kissing her before she left, for not kissing her every day in high school.
Chapter 9. It was a bad decision to come to the bar. I remembered it from high school, a place nestled between the barber shop and a set of apartments. A little nothing, nowhere place. Walking in, I thought it was perfect for what I needed. I stayed, however, because I needed the alcohol, and I needed to not be left alone. A woman on the other side of the bar was smoking, and a haze began to hang over the room, casting everyone into a kind of shadowy world. But I wasn't thinking of the bar now. I was thinking of the feeling of Brad's lips on mine, so soft and gentle as he slipped his tongue into my mouth. I gasped and grabbed the collar of his shirt to pull him closer. Then I ran my lips over the strong line of his jaw. I felt and heard him take a sharp breath as I kissed the spot just behind his jaw. He let out a low sound that was almost a growl, gripped my hips tightly and pushing me against the wall. His hands traveled up my stomach, touching lightly, intensifying the heat that had started to pool in my stomach. With one hand, he cupped my cheek and buried his fingers in my hair, and with the other hand, he cupped my breast, squeezing lightly. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, running my hands up his biceps and over his broad, strong shoulders. I wanted nothing more than for him to pick me up and push me against the wall. My stomach was heating up, and I felt desire in my core. I moved closer to him, waiting for his answer. He shuddered at my touch and pulled back a bit. "I can't," he said. "I won't. I'm not going to be with a woman unless she is my wife." His eyes were so intent, so passionate, I knew that even drunk, he wasn't going to have sex with me. My body screamed in disappointment, and I gripped him closer, my mind racing with possibilities, with a way to get this man to take me. Though his words should have thrown an icy realization over me, should have woken me from my lust and brought me back to reality, they didn't, and instead made my heart jump violently. So I sighed, closed my eyes, and tightened my grip on his shirt. "Then let's get married," I found myself saying. The logical part of my brain, the part of me that was the owner and founder of XL Corporation, was telling me this was a terrible idea. She was adamant, tapping her foot, her arms crossed against the idea of me marrying a man simply so I could have sex with him. The part of me that could only focus on the building heat in my core, the insistence to press my hips against his. That part of me was ignoring her. This was the part of me that had peaked at high school Brad, laying on his stomach on the floor by my bed as I read to him. This was the girl that had wished for him to climb up into the bed with me, take my shirt off, touch me. And she was winning. Brad smiled goofily after a moment, his eyes jumping back and forth between mine. We stared at each other for a moment, then he pulled me close, into an earth-shattering hug. I could feel him everywhere against me, his body warm and solid, fitting to mine perfectly. I wrapped my arms around him tightly, hoping to get him even closer. I thought fleetingly that I might marry him for hugs like this. "Okay," he said, pulling back. "Let's get married. But how?" "Vegas," I said, patting my pockets for my phone. "We live 40 minutes from Las Vegas, Brad. I'll call a cab." 5 sloppy minutes later, the cab pulled up and we clambered in. Me first, then Brad sliding in next to me. The cabbie looked at us and shook his head. "You know the fare to Vegas is expensive, right? We talked about this on the phone." "Just go," Brad said, his voice low and commanding. I broke out into giggles at the sound of it and leaned back in my seat, breathing heavily. The cabbie pulled away, and minutes later we were on the highway. Brad wrapped his arm around me and pulled me close to him. His hand was on my thigh, and he squeezed rhythmically. I tried not to focus on it, but it was heightening my senses and making me want to touch him more. The 40 minutes to Vegas went by in agony, and I was beginning to get tired when we stopped outside the chapel. The lights were bright and flashing when we pulled up. We stumbled out of the cab, and I tipped the cabbie while Brad ran his hands over my sides and legs. We walked into the fake chapel, and I could not take my hand off of his arm because it felt as though he was holding me up. "Welcome," the lady said when we walked in. Moments later, they had taken our names, and we were standing together, waiting behind another couple that was getting married. I looked up at Brad, who was smiling down at me. When it was our turn, we stepped up to the altar, and the priest began reading the marriage rites. I took Brad's hands and stared at him. A swell of happiness bloomed in my chest, and my teenage self was ecstatic. She could not believe I was getting married to Brad Walker. "Would you like to add anything?" the priest asked when he was through with his part. Brad was staring at me, his eyes intent and focused on me. I wanted to fall into him, but I managed to stay on my feet. "I was in love with you," Brad said, seeming for a moment like he was perfectly sober. "In high school, I was in love with you, but I was also scared of you, and that's why I never told you. And that's why it hurt so much when you left. But now that I have you back, I am never going to let you go." I could not stop the tear that was trailing down my cheek, and Brad reached up, wiping it away gently. I took a deep breath and tried to think of something to say that would as eloquent as what he had said. I thought about high school and about the way it felt to pine over him. "I was in love with you." I finally managed to get out. "And that's all I have to say." I took the plastic ring they had given me when we came in and slid it on his finger slowly. Then he slid one onto mine as well. We kissed, and then we were given our certificate and 2 Polaroids. I stuffed the certificate into my purse, and he slid the Polaroids into his back pocket. On the street outside the chapel, we stopped and kissed again, and my head was spinning with the reality of what we had just done. I called one of the hotels in town and got us one of the nicest suites. It wasn't a busy day, and it was open, and I was willing to pay. The cab came and picked us up, and as soon as we were in, Brad had his hands all over me. Grazing my thighs, cupping my ass, touching my stomach, his hands didn't still the entire time. Right as we pulled up outside the hotel, he tried to pull me into his lap. I laughed and clambered out of the cab, leading him inside the extravagant hotel. We passed fountains and sculptures to get to the lobby, where they showed us to our room. As soon as the door closed behind us, Brad had his hands on my waist and he was pushing me back to the bed. I gasped as he untucked my blouse from my pants and his hands slipped under, swiftly pulling it over my head. He stopped for a moment and held me at arm's length. "God," he said, "do you know how long I've waited to do this?" He pulled me close and kissed me again, one hand on the back of my head and the other spanning my back. I grabbed his shirt in my fists, feeling the smooth fabric bunch. I pulled it up and off of him to reveal the smooth chest underneath. I ran my hands over it, then down his stomach, over the toned muscles there and to the button on his jeans. In one quick move, I had unbuttoned his jeans, and they were loose enough that when the backs of my legs hit the bed, they were halfway down his thighs. He pushed me back and put one strong arm above my head, holding himself up as he kissed me. I ran my hands over his chest, gasping as he unclipped my bra and, one arm at a time, slipped it off so he could throw it across the room. When my chest was bare, he let out a low growl and dipped down, kissing my neck and chest, then running his tongue along the swell of my breast. I moaned and arched my back, aching to feel his mouth on me. He crawled further up the bed, and I went with him. He wrapped his hands around my wrists and pinned my hands above my head, returning to my chest and taking a nipple in his mouth. I squirmed and arched my back under his touch and tried to remember the last time a man had made me feel the way I was feeling. Uncontrollable, lusting, crazy. He released my hands and hooked his thumb in the side of my panties, tugging each side until they slid smoothly down my legs. I kicked them off and gasped at the fact that I was now completely naked. He stopped and looked at me, painstakingly slowly from head to toe. I brought my hands up to cover my breasts, but he caught them and laced his fingers in mine. "Stop," he said. "They're beautiful." "You're beautiful." Objectively, I knew that, but hearing it from his mouth made chills erupt on my skin. I reached down for the waistband of his boxers, but he slipped out of the way. "No," he said. "Not yet." I closed my eyes and tipped my head back as he kissed my breasts and down my stomach, peppering kisses around my navel. I gasped as he placed his hands on the inside of my thighs, pushing them open. He kissed my navel again, repositioning himself so he was between my legs. Slowly, he kissed the insides of my thighs. I could feel his breath, brushing softly over my legs and triggering an intense sensation between them. Gently, he kissed around me, not delving inside. He snaked his hands up and around, and I reached down, lacing his hands with mine. "Wait," I breathed, as he flicked his tongue out once, making my body shake with pleasure. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said slowly. "I want to." I closed my eyes and let my head drop back against the pillow, moaning and squeezing his hands as he went to work. Each touch set my body on fire, wound the cord inside me tighter and tighter, until I was gasping and writhing on the bed. "Fuck," I half said, half moaned as the wound cord inside me let go, racking waves of pleasure through my body, starting at Brad and traveling up my torso and down my legs, until I could feel it in the tips of my fingers and toes. When I fell back into the pillow, he crawled up the bed slowly, kissing each part of me as he did. When he got to my face, he paused for a moment. I opened my eyes and brought my hands up, burying my hands in his hair and whispering his name, before pulling him into a kiss. "That was amazing," I whispered, before bracing my hands on his chest and rolling over so I was on top of him. He looked up at me, surprised at the move. I leaned down and kissed him slowly, then I reached down and slowly slid his boxers off. "So," I said, once I had him completely naked underneath me. "Let's do it again."
Chapter 10. Macy was perched above me, her strawberry blonde hair falling over her shoulders and resting on her breasts. I had never thought, not in my wildest dreams, that I would have her sitting in my lap, in a hotel in Las Vegas. I could not remember exactly how we had gotten to where we were, but just in case it was only going to happen once, I wanted to be there for every moment of it. Though I could still taste the whiskey on my breath, I was beginning to feel things more, like the feel of her skin and the smell of her hair, and I realized it was probably a bad idea to drink before my first time with her. But I pushed the thought away and focused on the feel of her body. "God," I whispered, running my hands over her breasts and feeling the perk of her nipples. She closed her eyes and I ran my hand down her body until I was between her legs. She was wet against me, and I felt another wave of blood rush down to my erection that I was sure was pressing against her. She lifted up slowly, then lowered down on top of me. I groaned and gripped her hips tightly as she moved slowly, teasing me and making my thoughts scatter. After a few moments of that, I growled and gripped her tightly, flipping her over so she was under me. Her curls fanned out around her face, and she bit her lip, as though she knew she was driving me crazy with her slow, methodical movement. I slid back inside of her and pushed my hips up slowly, until she closed her eyes and gasped. She gripped my shoulders tightly, and I rocked into her, making her breathe heavily. "Yes," she said, "faster." I put one hand on the headboard and the other under her head, thrusting into her. I had never needed someone so much, and I felt the pressure building with each push, until I knew I was about to come. "Do you want me to pull out?" I asked roughly through labored breathing. She shook her head, her eyes still closed, her hands on my shoulders, gripping tightly. "I'm cuming," she said, her breathing quick and her words terse. I shook and jerked as I came, experiencing an orgasm on a level that I never had before. Macy gripped me tightly, her fingernails digging into my skin as she arched her chest so it pressed against mine. After a moment, I let go of the headboard. I kissed her on the forehead gently and sighed as I pulled out, coming to lay beside on her on the bed. She cuddled into me, breathing heavily. "Brad," she said, "did you really love me in high school?" She said after a moment. "No," I said. "I was in love with you in high school." She paused for a long moment, and I wondered if maybe she had fallen asleep. I ran my hand over her hair gently and moved it out of her face, and she stirred, looking up at me again. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because I was in love with you, but I just assumed you would never like me back." Because, I don't know. "I assumed the same thing about you," I said. "You were smarter, better at everything than me. It didn't seem likely to me that you would want to be with a guy like me. A stupid guy." Macy shook her head against my chest. "You are not stupid," she said. "Nor were you in high school. I think you just acted like that." I shrugged because I wasn't exactly sure of the reason why I didn't tell her in high school either. It might have been that she was the only person I really considered my friend, and it might have been that I didn't want to lose that. Another long moment passed, and I realized that though I had definitely been drunk when we arrived in the city, I wasn't anymore, only buzzed. I tried to remember what brought us here, but I decided I would ask Macy in the morning. When the morning came, I woke up to the smell of pancakes and sausage, and opened my eyes to see room service, bringing in plates and plates of breakfast food. Macy came around the corner a moment later, wrapped in a fluffy white robe, her hair damp. "Good morning," she said somewhat meekly, and I sat up, swallowing hard and looking around at all the food, though my eyes eventually landed on her bare feet, traveling up her legs until they disappeared under the robe. "Good morning," I said, realizing my voice was rough with sleep. I cleared my throat and looked at the food around me again, then met her green eyes. "What's all this?" She tucked a damp strand of hair behind her ear. "I wanted to order breakfast, but I wasn't sure what you like or if you like the same stuff still." I laughed, looking at the ridiculous amount of food that was strewn through our room. "So, you just decided to go with everything?" I asked, still laughing. "Yeah," she said, meeting my eyes and laughing too. "I suppose I did." "Well," I said, taking the lid off of one of the plates and letting the steam billow out, "then I suppose we should get to work on it." I patted the spot next to me on the bed, and Macy came over, sitting so our legs were pressed together. Flashes of what had happened the night before ran through my mind, and my heart picked up its pace, though I tried to tell it that there was probably no chance that it would be happening again. "Last night was pretty great," Macy said suddenly, shocking me enough that I coughed on the piece of French toast I was chewing. She stood up worriedly, but I coughed it out and sat for a moment, taking deep breaths. Then, when I finally looked up at her, I wheezed, "Yeah, it was pretty great." We laughed for a moment, at our situation, at the sound of my voice, at the amount of food that was gathered in the room. She smiled at me warmly, running her hands over her own arms. "This is bad, isn't it?" she asked finally. "I'm probably not supposed to sleep with one of the fathers at the school I'm working at." "It's not a big deal," I said, tucking a slice of prosciutto into my mouth. "It's not like you're actually one of Stella's teachers or anything like that." "Yeah," she said, "I suppose you're right. But we should probably be getting back soon anyway. I have some things to go over for work, and I really should get them done before the weekend ends." "No," I said. "Yeah, absolutely, we should. I really have to attend to my couch. She has been alone for too long." It wasn't until after I had cleaned up and we were walking out of the hotel room that Macy turned to me and said, "Your couch is female." The cab ride back to Goodsprings was polite and comfortable, and though it was clear that Macy and I had taken our relationship to a point it had never been at before, I knew somehow that we would still be friends. We didn't have to make things awkward just because we had sex, I thought, and who knew? Perhaps at a point in the future, if it was late and we were both willing. "Brad," Macy said, breaking me free from my thoughts, "this is your stop." I shook my head and to try and lose some of the images from the night before, like her breasts and how perfect they looked in that hotel room. But they stuck. "Right," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'll see you later, Macy." "Yeah," she said, tucking her hair behind her ear and looking away from me. "See you later." I climbed out of the taxi and walked into my house, telling myself not to look back at the cab. Inside, the house was quiet and dark because Stella was still with her grandmother, and she wouldn't be bringing her back until the evening. I sighed and fell into the couch, wondering if the rest of the weekend could possibly be as good as the beginning. I flipped the TV onto the Food Network, but soon found myself lost in thoughts of Macy. I would focus on the TV for a few moments and get inspiration to create a new dish. And then I would drift back to thinking about the way Macy had looked, naked on the white sheets in the hotel room, or how she felt when she pulled me close to her and bit my lip, or the way she smiled at me when she said that she was in love with me. A shiver raced up my back, and I sat up straighter, trying to hold on to the last memory. When had she told me that she was in love with me? Had I told her the same thing? I closed my eyes and pictured her, standing across from me, my hands in hers. Someone else was there too, but I could not place it. I shifted in my place and felt something stab into my ass through my jeans. I stood and checked the couch, but finding nothing, I sat back down, only to find that the thing stabbing me was in my pocket. I pulled out 2 Polaroids from my pocket, both picturing Macy and I, smiling goofily, as we stood in front of a priest. The blood in my body drained to the floor as I realized what it was that we had been doing in Las Vegas. I dropped my head into my hands and thought about the promise I had made to myself that the next woman I was with would be one that I was committed to, one that I would be married to before I ever touched her. The counselor had told me that it was unrealistic and a bad idea that would encourage bad choices, and I hadn't listened to her. I stared at the picture, wondering how it was that we could have done something like that when my phone started ringing. I threw the pictures on the coffee table and answered the phone, standing and walking to the kitchen, which was the one room in the house that calmed me down. "Do you know what I just found in my purse?" Macy said, her voice shrill through the phone. "A marriage certificate with our names on it. Brad, what the fuck is going on? Did we get married last night?" I ran my hand through my hair and chewed on my thumb. "Yeah, I suppose we did. But that doesn't mean we have to stay married, so don't panic," I said, thinking at 1,000,000 miles per minute. "I am sure the state has to undo these kinds of marriages all the time," I said, hoping I was helping to calm her down. "Yeah," she said, "I suppose, but do you know what this is going to do to my taxes? I need to call the company lawyer right away." I was so preoccupied trying to calm Macy down that I didn't hear the door open. "I mean, yeah, call your lawyer," I laughed. "That sounds like an easy fix, Macy." "Lawyers can't fix everything, Brad," she said, then paused. "I mean, it's not like marrying you was a mistake." "No," I said, laughing tersely. "It was a mistake, and it was stupid, and I am sure I talked you into it. I just wish I could remember, you know?" "Yeah," she said, "I know. Listen, I am going to call my lawyer and see what there is to be done about this, and how quickly we can get it undone. I'll get back to you. I might even stop by, just so we can talk face to face." I said goodbye to her and hung up the phone, thinking about what might happen when she came over. I could remember bits and pieces from the night before, and it had been good. I could not imagine what it might be like to push her up against the wall when she came in. I expected to have some time before she would be at the door, however, and I expected to be able to fall onto the couch and watch the Food Network before she arrived. What I didn't expect was to see Stella standing in the middle of the living room with one of the Polaroids in her hand. When I saw her, I was shocked, and though I knew she wasn't supposed to be home until later, I was still seeing her in the middle of the living room. She didn't look at me, but I could see the tears welling in her eyes. "Grandma sucks," she said. "Even if she is going to help me pay for school." I decided to come home early. I didn't say anything, looking back and forth between the Polaroid in her hand and her face, trying to figure out what it was that her reaction would be to this turn of events. Would she be mad that I was with Macy, who was almost her teacher? Would it be awkward for her to work with her now? I swallowed hard as Stella opened her mouth to speak. "Mom's gone," she said, finally meeting my eyes. "Mom is dead," she said, her pitch and volume rising dangerously. "And you wouldn't marry her. She wanted you to, and you know it." She stopped for a moment and ran her hand over the Polaroid in her hand, then threw it back down on the coffee table where the other one was still sitting. "But you married her?" she shrieked, stalking from the room. I followed her, adrenaline pumping through my veins. "Stella, it's not what you think," I said, my hands up. "I know that I made a mistake, but it has nothing to do with you or your mother." Stella stopped and turned around, and I realized she was walking back toward the front door. "It has nothing to do with me? She's my teacher, you jerk." I... She stopped and swiped at a stray tear. "I still love Mom." I know that for you, it was so easy to get over it, because you clearly never even loved her. Stella grabbed the picture on the mantel of the three of us the year her mother passed away and threw it on the ground so hard the crash resounded through the house and in my brain. Stella! Fuck you! She screamed at me, stomping her boot on the broken glass. Just let me help you get rid of her because you never cared in the first place. Go to your room, I finally thundered, my anger at seeing the picture on the floor, covered with broken glass, too much to control. Stella flipped me off and stomped past me, brushing my shoulder with force. The door to her room slammed a moment later, and I crouched down, putting my head in my hands, being careful not to move so I wouldn't cut myself on the broken glass around me.
Chapter 11. I knocked on the front door, waiting for Brad to answer. I brushed my hair away from my face and thought about what had happened the night before. Though getting married had been an obvious mistake, I was starting to think that everything else that had happened wasn't. Brad had told me that he loved me when we were in high school, and as much as my logical side disputed it, one half of me believed we were meant to be. When nobody answered the door, I tried the handle and found it to be open. For a moment, I hesitated, but convinced myself that Brad had probably just fallen asleep on the couch and didn't hear me knocking. I thought about waking him up with a kiss, running my hands through his hair, and crawling on top of him on the couch. What I walked into was much different than I had expected. Brad was crouching in the front room, a short-handled broom and dustpan in his hands. He was crying, or he had been, because his cheeks were wet and his eyes were red. I stopped in my tracks and looked at him, taking in the wide arc of glass that was broken around him. I thought of the night I had broken the vase, then saw the picture on the ground. Casey Lee was smiling up at me, still looking at me like she thought I ought to do something different than what I was doing. "Oh," Brad said, standing up and sliding the pile of glass in the dustpan into the trash. "I forgot you were coming." "Brad?" I asked. My heart nearly stopped in my chest. "What happened? What's going on?" He took a moment, then swiped the back of his hand over his forehead, looking up at the ceiling. The air between us was still for a moment, and I held my breath. "Stella found out," he said finally, meeting eyes with me. "She saw the pictures. I mean, the chapel. They gave us pictures, and I must have put them in my pocket because she saw them. She said that I never loved her mother, which isn't true because I loved her so damn much. And she just left us." I took a deep breath and stepped across the glass that was still on the ground, wrapping Brad in a hug. His arms hung limply at his sides, still holding the brush and dustpan. When I pulled back and met his eyes again, I sensed the sadness there and wished I knew what to do to make him feel better. I wanted to call Elizabeth and ask her what to do, but I didn't want the information going around the office that not only was I married, but I had gotten married impulsively. I tried to think about what she would say to me, how she would tell me to straighten my shoulders and be there for Brad. He sighed. "I don't know what to do. She was so angry with me, I've never seen her like that before. It makes me wonder if she actually does blame me for her mother's death, or if I blame myself, or if either of us knows what the fuck is going on." I put my hands on his cheeks and tried to steady him. "It's going to be okay," I said. "I'll go talk to her. I'll see if I can't calm her down a bit, okay?" "I don't know if that's a good idea," he started to say, but I put my finger over his lips, silencing him. "She's had some time to calm down, and you were the first person she saw. You're who she took it out on. I'm sure I can talk some sense into her. Let her know that it was just a silly mistake, you know?" "Okay," he said, looking back down at the glass. "I'm going to finish cleaning this up." I nodded and stepped out of the glass, hoping none of it had embedded itself in my shoes, because I didn't want to track it through the rest of the house. The last thing anyone needed was a trip to the emergency room to surgically remove a piece of glass from their foot. The door to Stella's room was plastered in posters and sticky notes, and I paused, trying to find the most appropriate place to knock. I knocked softly, waiting for a moment, and when she said nothing, I called into the room. "Stella? I know you're mad at your father, but let's talk about this, okay?" Your father and I know that this was a mistake, and you should know that it has nothing to do with your mother." When she still said nothing, I tried the handle and was surprised to find that the door was unlocked. It came open easily, and I saw the same room that I had been in before. The prototypes for her project were lined up nicely on her desk, schematics were taped to the wall, and the chair was pushed into her desk. The bed was made neatly, and a single stuffed hippo was sitting atop the pillows. The room was neat and tidy, with a row of Converse lined up against one row and full of knickknacks and posters. But one thing was missing. Stella. I stepped into the room and opened the closet, hoping to see her curled up on the floor, maybe hiding from her father. I knew that she was probably too old for that, but I could not help hoping, because I knew that was better than the alternative I discovered when the closet was devoid of anything other than clothes. Stella was gone. Calmly, I walked back out to the main room where Brad had finished cleaning up the glass and appeared to be calming down. When he saw me, he ran a hand over his hair and chewed on his lip. "How did she take it? Did she talk to you? I know you don't have to do this, and I just wanted to say thank you. Raising her can be so difficult when she won't talk to me." "Brad," I said, cutting him off as the urgency of the situation rose with each passing second. "She's gone." "What?" he asked, looking at me as though he didn't fully understand the word. "She's not in her room," I said, and I checked the bathroom on my way back. "Unless she is somewhere else in the house. She is not here." Brad stepped around me, cupping his hands to his lips and calling for her. When nothing happened, he looked in the bathroom and in the laundry room and in the study. When she didn't reveal herself, he shouted through the house again. "Stella, you need to get your ass out here right now. This isn't funny." After walking frantically through the house again and still not finding her, he shouted again. "Stella, please, please come out. I'm sorry, honey. I'm sorry. Please come out." As he was about to make another round through the house, I caught him by the arm and held him with a hand on each forearm. He met my eyes, and in his, I saw the crazed, desperate look I had only ever seen in a parent's eyes. "Brad," I said sternly, "she's not here. Can you think of anywhere else she might go?" He dropped his head into his hands and fell into the couch, putting his elbows on his knees. He shook his head against his hands, sniffling. "Oh, God," he said, his voice broken. "This is like losing her all over again." "Brad," I said, this time louder. "Think. I don't know." He said, "Maybe her grandmother's? Maybe, I don't know, I can't call that woman. If she knows that I don't know where Stella is, she'll rip her away from me." "Okay." I tried to keep my voice calm. "Do you think Stella likes her grandmother? Like, would that be comforting for her to go there?" "No," Brad said right away. "Neither of us like that woman. Casey Lee didn't even like her, and it was her mother. Does she have a friend's house that she might go to?" I asked, still trying to think about where I would have run away to when I was that age. I could not think of anything, however, because I was always most comfortable in my own room. "No," he said. "I mean, she has some friends at school, but other than that, it's always just been—" He paused for a moment, then pushed to his feet, grabbing his coat from the hook by the door as he went. "Come on," he said. "I think I know where she is." I followed him from the house as he erratically got into his car, peeling out of his driveway and skittering onto the road. We drove in silence for a few tense minutes, then he turned on a gravel road that I recognized as the one that led out of town. Though I was confused, I stayed silent, just watching the trees pass by. A moment later, we rolled into the cemetery, and a realization dawned on me. I searched through the headstones, trying to find the right one, but Brad stopped the car and got out, knowing exactly which way to walk. We walked for a moment, then she was in sight. Stella was sitting on the ground, resting against her mother's gravestone, her blonde hair shining brightly in the afternoon sun. Tears were running steadily down her cheeks, and though I wondered if perhaps she had come here to talk to her mother, she wasn't saying anything now. Her eyes closed and her head tipped upwards. "What should we do?" Brad asked, sadness evident in his voice. I hated that he was in pain, and I hated that Stella was as well, and for a moment I felt the guilt of my part in the situation. Go talk to her, I said softly. Maybe Casey Lee can mediate between the two of you. He shook his head, dropping his head to his hands. I can't think of anything right to say. If I had been able to, this wouldn't have happened in the first place. We stood in silence for a moment, looking at the young girl. The air around us smelled sweet and was cool against my face as the breeze pushed through the trees and against us. Will you go talk to her? He pleaded, and when I looked over at him, his eyes were closed. I nodded, then realizing he couldn't see me, I put my hand on his arm so he would look at me. I will, I said. But I think you guys should have a serious conversation after this. About Stella's mother, and about love. He nodded, and I took my hand from his arm, making my way between the graves and towards Stella. If she heard me approaching, she didn't look up. I sat down next to her mother's grave, crossing my legs and being careful not to lean on the gravestone. My mother passed too, I said softly. And not until after I was an adult, but it still hurts. Stella opened one eye and looked over at me, raising an eyebrow like she wasn't surprised to see me. I took a deep breath and tried to think about what I would have wanted to hear when I was that age. And my father, he's married now, I said, to someone nearly my age, which sucks. But that doesn't matter because he is allowed to love who he loves. And I know it doesn't mean he loved my mom any less. Were your parents married? Stella asked, opening both eyes and turning to me. I swallowed, knowing that I would have been particular about the details too. Yes, I said, but marriage is not synonymous with love. I blushed, realizing that was something I had said to Brad weeks before. I also felt the plastic ring in my pocket and realized it was true. It didn't matter if Brad and I were married. I loved him before our trip to Vegas, and I would keep loving him long after. I know that's true, Stella said, closing her eyes and making her hands into fists. But it doesn't matter. I can't help feeling just so angry. That will never go away, I said, looking up the hill to where Brad was standing. All the best people in life are the angry ones. Those are the ones who keep fighting, you know? Stella was silent for a moment, then shook her head. I have to forgive him. He's all that I have left. It just sucks, she said, because I want him to be better, and I want him to be perfect, and I know that's not fair. I want to be able to go back in the past and have him buy a ring for Mom. I keep thinking that maybe if Mom knew that she had something to lose, things would have turned out differently. I shook my head. I know it can be hard, but you have to understand that your mother's decision had nothing to do with you or your father. Mental illness is just like other illness. If she had cancer, her death would have nothing to do with either of you too. We sat quietly for a moment, then Stella climbed to her feet and patted her hands on her jeans, then held a hand out to me. I took it and stood, and together we walked back to her father, who wordlessly took Stella in his arms and held her tightly. Please, he said. Please never run away like that again. I won't even ground you this time if you promise not to do it again. Okay, Stella said, though it was muffled in her father's shirt. The two hugged for a moment, and I stood to the side, watching. We all climbed back into Brad's car and made our way home. He stopped and got something for us to eat, and I wished it was his cooking instead of McDonald's. Before we walked into the house as the sun was setting, Stella caught my arm. Thank you, she said. I wondered if it was for talking to her, or for looking for her, or for taking care of her dad. I decided not to ask as we all walked into the house together. Stella sat on the couch and turned the TV on like nothing was different as Brad and I went to the kitchen. He got us each a glass of wine, and this time, rather than nursing it like I did last time, I took long sips, draining the glass before he was done pouring his. He laughed and poured more for me, then rubbed his hand over his forehead. I don't know that we should drink so soon after getting married, he said. We might end up divorced. Or worse, with a mortgage. I laughed, mostly because I didn't know what it was like to have a mortgage. I had lived my entire life in apartments and penthouses, and now if I wanted to buy a house, I would just buy it outright. I took another long drink of my wine and thought about the word divorced and what it would feel like to be someone who had one. Can I fight for custody? I asked jokingly. Brad took a long drink of his wine, too. I don't know, he said. I think after today you might be able to. And I think Stella might choose you. I am sure that's not true, I said, laughing and marveling at the idea of having a daughter. I hadn't thought about having children while I was in California, and the thought of it now made me sad. I glanced into the living room where Stella was fast asleep, curled up on the couch. I could imagine being like a mother to her and helping her through life in the way I wished my parents could have helped me. Of course, no one could ever replace Casey Lee. She really does respect you, Brad said, then winced when Stella mumbled something and moved around on the couch. Here, he said, picking up his wine. Let's take this to the porch. It was late fall and the air was chilled, but Brad switched on a fireplace on the porch as soon as we came out, and the space warmed up nicely. I sat down on the swinging bench and Brad sat next to me, setting his hand on my knee. Listen, he said when I looked up at him. He set his wine on the table and took my other hand in his. I know that you think us getting married was a mistake, and that's fine. But I'm beginning to feel like it wasn't a mistake at all. I meant what I said. I was in love with you in high school, and though it's true that I loved Casey Lee, I don't think I ever stopped loving you. And I can't help feeling that with you is where I'm supposed to be. And with Stella. I mean, you're her role model. She wants to be just like you. I can't think of a better person to be a stepmother to my daughter. I took a breath, my heart pausing in my chest for a moment as I digested his words. The air around us was still, and the only noise that could be heard was the occasional whir of a car passing along the road a few houses over. Brad's dark brown eyes were liquid amber in the crackle of the fireplace, and I took a long look at them. I'm asking you, he said slowly. I'm asking you to stay married to me, Macy. I'm asking you to be my wife, for the rest of our lives. I want to grow old with you. And I know that being with a mechanic may not be your dream, and I can work harder to be something better for you. I lunged forward, catching his lips and cutting off his words. He melted into me, his fingers cold against the warm skin on my stomach. Yes, I said. Of course. You didn't think I devised that whole plan just to annul the marriage, did you? He grinned wickedly at me again. Let's go to my room. We snuck past a sleeping Stella and tiptoed up the stairs. In his room, he lifted me up and laid me down on the bed, hovering above me. He kissed my cheeks, my forehead, my lips, and my neck. I giggled as he took my shirt off, struggling to get it over my arms. We were much smoother when we were drunk, weren't we? I asked, still laughing. Were you drunk? He asked, finally getting the shirt off. He threw it across the room and got to work on my bra. I sat up against him, putting my hand on his chest. Take your clothes off, I said, wiggling away from him so I could take my pants off. Right now. He obeyed, and moments later we were both naked. He took me in his arms and pushed me back down on the bed. I tried to remember, but I could not recall if the way his skin felt at this moment, pressed against mine, was the way it had felt the first time we were together. He ran his hands over my skin and slid inside me, filling me up and increasing the pressure in my abdomen. I gasped and wound my hands up in his hair, giggling a bit. The giggling faded as he rocked into me again. The tension increased. I closed my eyes and dropped my head back against the arm of the bench. Macy, he breathed. Fuck, you feel so good. You, I breathed back. You too. I opened my eyes and he smiled down at me, his eyes wide and bright and alive. I was thankful for the moment, and that we both knew exactly what we were doing. I love you, I said breathlessly, as he shuddered and finished. He realized I hadn't come and he moved to the side, sliding his hand down my stomach and moving rhythmically until I was shaking and calling his name. Afterwards, we held each other, and it felt right. Like it was meant to be. Like it was meant to last forever.
Chapter 12. The high school was full to the brim with excited students, and I could not figure out where it was that I was supposed to go. Everything looked different from the last time I was here, and it wasn't helping that the students around me were too rushed in what they were doing to keep from turning me around. I was thinking about just finding Macy's office and hoping someone would come find me there when I saw that head of familiar strawberry blonde hair heading right toward me. I moved through the ocean of students until I got to her. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I can assume you are trying to find the gymnasium?" "Mrs. Johnson," I said, smiling and tipping an imaginary hat to her. "You're absolutely correct." She gestured a different direction than the one I had been going, and I hurried after her, following her down a different hallway than the one I remembered to get to the gym. As we went, she told me all about the event that was taking place, the same event that had all the students going crazy in the hallways. "There are actually business representatives scattered throughout the crowd today," she said, not glancing back at me as we walked. Her hair was up in a high ponytail, and I could not take my eyes off of it as it bounced. I didn't tell the kids because I don't want them to be nervous, but it's possible that one of the representatives may offer to buy their projects or the rights to them, and it's also possible that they could offer scholarships or internships. It all just depends on their performance today. Really, anything is possible, and my scholarship isn't even the beginning of it. My eyes traveled down from her ponytail and to her waist, covered by a white blouse that was tucked into a black pencil skirt. "Stella's doing really well," Macy continued. "She's been tweaking her final project for the past 3 days, and honestly, I am not sure that she has gone to any her classes. I am also not sure that I really care all that much about it. Matt, you remember Matt? He's been working on the coding with her, and really, she's gotten so good at it. I've told you all of this before, though, haven't I? I feel like I'm rambling along, and of course it's just a release of nervous energy because I want all of these kids to do well, you know?" "Yeah," I said, my eyes falling further down to her ass, swaying back and forth in front of me. I could hear the sound of the bustling gym as we neared it, and I felt a shiver run up my back. "Do you think Stella will win?" "I'm not sure," Macy said. "She's certainly a contender. There are a lot of other talented kids. Many of them came to me for help after Stella did. But honestly, you and I both know she received more help from me than anyone else. I mean, that's obvious because I'm at your house so much." Before we walked into the gym, I snaked my arms around her waist and twisted her around, pressing her into the entrance to the women's restroom. I dipped my head and kissed her neck, her cheeks, and bit her earlobe gently. "I don't think Stella received more help from you than anyone else," I whispered. "I think that place is solely for me." Macy breathed a laugh and rolled her eyes, but appeared more calm than when we had been walking down the hallway. I brushed a stray piece of hair from her eyes and kissed her forehead, wondering how it was that I had ended up with such a beautiful wife. "You're going to do fine," I said, "and the kids are going to do fine, and Stella is going to do fucking spectacular." She hit my arm and glanced around as though if someone were around, they would be more offended by my cussing and not by the two of us, pressed together in an embrace in the entrance to the women's restroom. "No cussing," she said, before pushing me off of her and slipping away, heading back down the hallway and toward the gym. I followed, my eyes drifting back down seconds after getting behind her. When we walked into the gym, the explosion of sound was so great, it managed to tear my eyes away from her and to the bustling energy inside. Tables were set up throughout the entire gym, and the bleachers were pushed up against the walls to allow for more space. Kids were everywhere, either standing with their projects, explaining them, desperately trying to fix them, or wandering around, looking at all the different things. There were theater kids desperately trying to set up a microphone I assumed would be for Macy to use. I looked around trying to find Stella in the crowd of many kids who were all dressed the same as her. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack if that needle was your daughter. I was torn from my mission of finding my daughter by a loud, ear-splitting squeal that came from right next to me. I turned to see Macy running to hug another woman, who had just arrived. She had short, neat blonde hair that was pin straight and didn't touch her shoulders. Her navy blue pantsuit was the most professional outfit I had ever seen in my life, and she was desperately thin, her limbs bending like a Barbie doll's. "Elizabeth!" Macy squealed, and I realized it was the woman my wife spent most of her time on the phone with. They hugged for a while, the kind of hug where you keep squeezing the other person, not wanting to let go. You look good, girl. Small town doing you right? Elizabeth asked before glancing over to me. Yes, Macy said, clapping her hands together. I'm so happy you could make it. Well, Elizabeth said, the company is probably in shambles, but it was worth leaving to come meet your husband. She said the word like there was something inherently wrong about it as she walked in a full circle around me, clearly examining me. Not bad, I suppose, she said when she had finished. The kids are excited to have you as a judge, Macy said. I mean, they don't know about it yet, but they will be excited. Elizabeth rolled her eyes and was soon absorbed into the crowd of people. Macy apologized and rushed off to do something, and I went back to my search for my daughter. I wandered through the gym for the next 5 minutes, looking for her. Are you looking for me? I turned around to see her standing next to a booth with a few weird devices lined up, and my daughter standing next to it. Yeah, I said, what's this? She rolled her eyes. I already told you, Dad. It's a device to administer CPR to small animals. I picked one up. It was like a teething toy for a baby, but softer. I looked up at my daughter, certain she was going insane. She sighed and took the device from me. Watch, she said, accessing her smartphone. Through the app, I can select the symptoms, the animal, whatnot, and the app will tell me if CPR is necessary, and she paused as the device changed shape slowly. Will adapt to the animal you need to help. A few more people had gathered around me. One of them was an official-looking woman with a clipboard, her straight brown hair pulled back from her face as she watched Stella demonstrate. Stella didn't seem to notice the extra people and kept going, telling me about how the device worked. The membrane is flexible so it can form to the animal, and the water is important because the first prototypes, with metal, would have broken the animal's ribs, which would have led to more problems. This final design is gentle enough to deliver solid, even pressure, without causing more damage. The water is what conducts the electrical pulses, which are different depending on what kind of animal you are working with. The microstructure within the water is what allows it to change and maintain shape, and that's comprised mainly of proteins. Stella had just finished her demonstration on a stuffed hamster when someone tapped the microphone. I looked around and realized most of the kids had stopped moving around. Ladies and gentlemen, and anything in between, Macy said, final exams have been taken, and grades are almost in. Who's ready to get that money? All the kids cheered wildly. All right, Macy said, smiling into the microphone. Judging is done, and we have our winners. Haley, Macy read off a few people who were runner-ups. And the grand prize winner, going home with the $100,000 scholarship, is Stella Walker. The gym erupted, and I looked over at Stella, whose mouth fell open. She looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. Dad, she said, hugging me. I did it! I can't believe I did it! A few local reporters came over and asked to take pictures. Stella got one herself with her device. The flash was bright, and for a moment I felt as though my daughter was a star. One with the family, one of the reporters said, and I stepped forward next to her. The reporter was about to take the picture, but Stella put her hand up. Hold on, Stella said. Where's Miss Johnson? I looked up and saw Macy standing just behind the reporters, watching. Stella waved her over, and she shuffled in slowly, looking embarrassed. Stella put her arm around her and whispered, Thank you, as we bunched together for the picture. Macy grinned and looked down at her, and I smiled as the camera flashed. The end. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this audiobook. Subscribe to this channel to be notified when new free audiobooks become available.